They buried Nora Dale's baby on a Tuesday, but her body refused to believe it was over. 3 weeks later, her breast still swelled with milk meant for a child who never drew breath. The ache so fierce she bit her lip bloody in the dark. Cast out by her own sister, sleeping on a borrowed cot that smelled like old flour, she overheard church women whisper about rancher Wyatt Kane. Widowed, in childbirth, twin babies starving, no woman willing to help a man touched by such fresh grief. That night, with nothing left to lose and her chest burning with milk that wouldn't dry, Nora walked into the darkness toward a ranch she'd never seen, carrying the only thing she had left to give. If you're watching from anywhere in the world, please comment with your city below. I'd love to see how far this story travels. Now settle in, because what happens next will break your heart open and put it back together in ways you never expected. The walk to the Kane Ranch took Nora Dale 2 hours through cold that bit straight through her threadbare shawl. She'd left her sister's house after midnight, when Victor's snoring finally guaranteed he wouldn't wake to stop her. Helen hadn't said goodbye, hadn't said much of anything for weeks, just looked at Nora with eyes that held equal parts pity and relief. Whenever Victor suggested maybe it was time Nora found somewhere else to grieve. Somewhere else. As if grief were a thing you could pack in a carpet bag and carry away from decent people. The moon hung low and swollen over the prairie, turning the rutted road silver. Nora's boots crunched through patches of frost, each step sending fresh pain through breasts so engorged they'd begun to leak through the binding she'd wrapped tight that morning. She'd tried everything the midwife suggested: cabbage leaves, cold compresses, drinking less water, but her body was stubborn as a mule, still preparing for a baby who would never need feeding. 3 weeks, she thought, pressing one hand against her chest as she walked. 3 weeks, and it won't stop. Won't let me forget. She'd been barely conscious when they told her the baby was gone. A boy, they said, perfect in every way except the one that mattered. He'd come too early, 2 months before his time, and his lungs simply hadn't been ready for the world. They'd let her hold him once, his tiny face already going waxy and cold, before the preacher's wife took him away to prepare for burial. After that came 3 days of fever, her body trying to kill her alongside the baby, and when she finally woke clear-headed enough to ask about arrangements, they told her Thomas had already seen to it. Thomas, her husband of 11 months, dead himself not 2 weeks after their son, crushed beneath a wagon wheel when the brake gave out on Carson Hill. Some men said he'd been drinking. Others said the wagon was poorly maintained. Nora suspected the truth was simpler. Thomas had stopped caring whether he lived or died, and the world had obliged him. That left Nora a widow at 23, childless and penniless, with a sister who'd taken her in out of obligation and a brother-in-law who made it abundantly clear that Christian charity only stretched so far. "We've got 4 mouths to feed already," Victor had said just that morning, his voice carrying through the thin walls while Nora pretended to sleep on her cot in the storage room. "Helen, I'm not saying turn her out in the cold, but the woman needs to start thinking about her future. There's positions available. Mrs. Henderson needs help with her wash, and the hotel's always looking for girls to clean rooms." "She just lost her baby," Helen had whispered back. "And her husband. Victor, she's my sister. And she's been here 3 weeks eating our food while my own children go without seconds. I'm not heartless, Helen, but facts are facts. She can't stay here forever." Nora had lain there in the dark, one hand pressed over her mouth to keep from making a sound, while shame and rage burned equal in her chest. As if I want to be here, she'd thought, as if I chose any of this. But what choice did she have? Thomas had left nothing, no property, no savings, just debts that his brother was still trying to settle. The house they'd rented had gone to someone else within a week. Her own mother was dead these 5 years, and her father had remarried a woman who made it clear there was no room for stepchildren in her tidy life. Helen was all Nora had, and Helen was stretched thin as January ice trying to keep peace with a husband who counted every penny and begrudged every bite. So when Nora had gone to church that Sunday, mostly because Helen insisted it would do her good to get out of the house, and heard Martha Simmons whispering to Ada Cooper about poor Wyatt Kane and those twin babies crying themselves sick while their father tried to figure out how to keep a ranch running and 2 newborns alive, something had shifted in Nora's chest. Not hope, exactly. Hope seemed too bright a word for what she felt, but something like purpose, maybe. A sense that the milk her body kept making, the maternal instinct that wouldn't let her sleep, the empty arms that ached to hold something. Maybe it wasn't all waste. Maybe there was someone who needed exactly what she had too much of. "Nobody will help him," Martha had said, her voice dropping low. "Not after what happened with his wife. They say she suffered something terrible, 2 days of labor before the second baby finally came. By the time it was over," she'd shaken her head. "Well, the Lord works in mysterious ways, but it seems especially cruel to take the mother and leave the babies with no one to feed them." "Why doesn't someone offer to nurse them?" Ada had asked. "Surely there's women in town. Would you?" Martha's eyebrows had risen. "Take your baby out to the cane ranch every day, or worse, move in with a grieving widower. The talk alone would ruin your reputation. And besides, Mary Kane was difficult when she was alive, made enemies. There's women in this town who'd rather let those babies starve than lift a finger to help Wyatt after the way Mary treated them." It had taken Nora 3 days to work up the courage. 3 days of Victor's pointed comments, Helen's apologetic silences, and sleepless nights where her body demanded she feed a baby she didn't have. 3 days of binding her breasts tighter and tighter, trying to ignore the burning pressure, until finally tonight, lying on that cot in the dark, she'd realized she had nothing left to lose. Her reputation? Already ruined. Everyone knew Thomas had married her because he'd gotten her with child, and that the baby had come too early anyway. Her future? She had none, not here, not without money or prospects or anyone to speak for her. Her dignity? That had died right alongside her son, buried in a grave so small it barely disturbed the earth. So she'd waited until the house fell silent, then packed her carpet bag with the few things that mattered: her mother's Bible, the patchwork quilt she'd been sewing from scraps, a change of clothes. She'd left no note. Helen would understand, or she wouldn't, and either way Victor would be relieved to have one less mouth at his table. The Kane Ranch appeared as a dark shape against the horizon, lamplight showing in one window like a beacon. As Nora drew closer, she could hear it, the sound that had haunted her dreams for 3 weeks straight. Babies crying. Not the angry wail of a hungry infant demanding attention, but the weak, exhausted mewling of babies who'd been crying so long they'd nearly given up. Her breasts responded immediately, milk letting down so fast it soaked through the binding and her dress both. Nora gasped at the sensation, half relief, half pain, and quickened her pace. The ranch house was smaller than she'd expected. Weathered wood that needed paint and a porch that sagged on one corner. The barn behind it looked sturdy enough, and she could hear cattle lowing in the distance, but everything had the air of a place barely holding itself together. Probably because the man trying to hold it was barely holding himself together either. Nora climbed the porch steps, her hand shaking as she raised it to knock. For a moment she hesitated, suddenly aware of how this must look. A strange woman appearing at a widower's door in the middle of the night, soaked through with milk and desperation. He'd probably send her away, probably thought she was insane. Maybe I am, she thought. Maybe grief has finally broken me completely. But then one of the babies inside let out a cry that was more whimper than wail, and Nora's body made the decision for her. She knocked, 3 sharp raps that seemed to echo in the cold night air. The crying inside stopped, or maybe just paused to draw breath. Footsteps, heavy and hurried. Then the door swung open, and Nora found herself face to face with Wyatt Kane. She'd seen him before, of course, in town and at church, though they'd never spoken. He was the kind of man you noticed without meaning to, tall and broad-shouldered, with dark hair that curled slightly at his collar, and hands scarred from a lifetime of hard work. But the man standing in the doorway now looked like a ghost of that person. His eyes were red-rimmed and wild, his shirt stained with what looked like spit-up and milk gone sour, and he held 2 tiny bundles against his chest like they were the last solid things in a world gone liquid. "Mrs. Dale?" His voice cracked on her name, confusion and exhaustion making him slow. "What are you—" "It's past midnight." "I know," Nora said quickly, before her courage could fail. "I know it's late, and I know how this looks. But I heard, in town, I heard about your babies, about your wife, and She pressed one hand against her chest, feeling the wet warmth of milk seeping through fabric. "My baby died 3 weeks ago, but my body doesn't know that. It keeps making milk for a child who isn't here, And I thought, I know it's strange. I know you don't know me, but I thought maybe... She trailed off, suddenly unable to finish the sentence. Unable to say out loud what she was really asking. Can I please give your children what my own child never got to have? Can I please make this terrible, useless milk worth something? Can I please pretend just for a little while that I'm still a mother? Wyatt stared at her for a long moment, and Nora watched a dozen emotions cross his face. Suspicion, hope, desperation, shame. Then one of the babies let out a weak cry, and his eyes closed briefly, something like a prayer passing across his features. They're dying, he said simply. I've tried everything, cow's milk, goat's milk, sugar water, but they just keep getting weaker. The doctor says if I can't find someone to nurse them soon... He didn't finish the sentence, didn't need to. May I? Nora asked, setting down her carpet bag and reaching for the nearest bundle. Wyatt hesitated only a moment before passing her the baby, so light it was like holding air wrapped in a blanket. Nora pulled back the edge of fabric and found herself looking down at a tiny girl with dark hair and skin so pale it was nearly translucent. Her eyes were closed, her breathing shallow, and when Nora touched her cheek, it felt cool. Oh, sweetheart, Nora thought, her heart clenching. Oh, you poor little thing. This is Lily, Wyatt said quietly, adjusting the other baby in his arms. And this is Jonah. They were born 2 weeks ago. My wife... His voice broke. Mary died just after Jonah came. She hemorrhaged. The doctor couldn't stop it. I'm sorry, Nora whispered, and meant it, though she'd never met Mary Kane and had only ever heard uncharitable things about her. Whatever the woman had been in life, she'd left behind 2 babies who needed someone desperately. That was all that mattered now. Lily stirred weakly against Nora's chest, her tiny mouth working in that instinctive search. Nora's breast responded with a sharp letdown that made her gasp. I need to... She looked up at Wyatt, feeling her face heat despite the circumstances. I need to feed her. Is there somewhere I can sit? He stepped back quickly, ushering her inside. The house was chaos, dishes stacked in the sink, laundry piled on every surface, the smell of sour milk and exhaustion hanging heavy in the air. But there was a rocking chair near the fire, and Nora sank into it gratefully. With shaking fingers, she unbuttoned her dress and unwrapped the binding, gasping again at the relief as pressure released. Her breasts were swollen and hot to the touch, veined with blue, impossibly full. She'd never produced this much milk even when the baby was alive. It was as if her body had known, somehow, that there were babies out there who needed her. Lily fussed weakly as Nora positioned her, then latched on with surprising strength for such a tiny thing. The pull was sharp and immediate, and Nora felt her milk let down in a rush that made the baby choke and sputter before finding her rhythm. Easy, Nora murmured, the word coming without thought. Easy now, little one. I know you're hungry, but you have to go slow. She looked up to find Wyatt watching them with an expression she couldn't quite name, relief and grief, and something else, something that looked almost like reverence. I didn't think it would work, he said hoarsely. I didn't think they'd even remember how. They haven't eaten properly in 3 days. They remember, Nora said softly, looking down at Lily's face. Already there was more color in her cheeks, and her breathing had deepened. Bodies remember. Wyatt moved closer, holding Jonah, and Nora could see that the boy looked even worse than his sister. His lips were cracked, his skin yellow with jaundice, and when he cried, it was barely more than a whisper. You'll need to feed him next, she said. And then probably again in a few hours. Newborns nurse constantly, especially if they're behind on weight. So you'll... Wyatt paused, seemed to struggle with the words. You'll stay. Just for tonight, I mean. Until they're stable. Nora met his eyes, saw the desperation there, and knew that just for tonight was a lie they were both willing to tell. These babies needed constant feeding, someone to watch them, hold them, keep them alive. And she was a woman with nowhere else to go and a body that wouldn't stop believing it had a purpose. Yes, she said quietly. I'll stay. Lily nursed for 20 minutes before falling into the first peaceful sleep she'd probably had in days. Nora switched her to the other breast briefly, just to ease the pressure, then passed her to Wyatt and held out her arms for Jonah. The boy was weaker than his sister, his suck less coordinated. But once he latched on properly, he drank with the same desperate relief, and Nora felt her milk flow freely, her body finally doing what it had been aching to do for weeks. Wyatt sank into the chair across from her, cradling Lily against his chest, and for a long moment they just sat there in silence, two devastated people held together by two tiny lives that refused to give up. "I couldn't do it," Wyatt said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. "Watching them fade, knowing I couldn't save them. After everything with Mary, after losing her the way I did, I couldn't—" He stopped, swallowed hard. "I prayed for someone to help, anyone. I didn't think God was listening anymore. Then you knocked on my door." "I'm not an answer to prayer," Nora said quietly. "I'm just a woman who lost her baby and didn't know what to do with the grief." "Maybe that's the same thing." Nora didn't answer. She looked down at Jonah instead, at his tiny face already looking less pinched, less gray. Her son had looked like this, she thought distantly. Same dark hair, same delicate features. But where her son had slipped away in silence, this boy was fighting his way back. Fighting because she was giving him what she'd never gotten to give her own child. "Does that make me a terrible person?" she wondered. "Using these babies to fill the hole my son left behind?" But then Jonah's eyes fluttered open, dark blue, unfocused, and he looked up at her with such perfect trust that something in Nora's chest cracked open. This wasn't about replacing what she'd lost. This was about saving what could still be saved, making her suffering count for something, turning the milk her body kept making into life instead of waste. When Jonah finished nursing, Nora burped him gently and checked his diaper. It was soaked through, and when she pulled it off, she found his tiny bottom was raw and red. "He needs to be cleaned," she said, looking up at Wyatt. "Do you have clean cloths, water?" Wyatt's face flushed. "I've been trying to keep up with it, but there's so much. I haven't had time to wash anything, and I keep running out of clean diapers, and I don't know how Mary did all of this while I was working." "It's all right," Nora interrupted gently. "Just show me where things are. I'll manage." What followed was a flurry of activity that pushed everything else from Nora's mind. She cleaned both babies thoroughly, fashioned fresh diapers from the least dirty cloths she could find, and got them settled in the cradle Wyatt had pulled close to the fire. Then she surveyed the disaster of the kitchen and rolled up her sleeves. "You should sleep," she told Wyatt, who was swaying on his feet with exhaustion. "I'll take care of things here. When the babies wake to nurse again, I'll come get you." "I can't ask you to." "You're not asking. I'm offering. Besides," she added, looking around at the chaos, "if I don't do something with my hands, I'll go mad. Might as well be useful." Wyatt studied her face for a long moment, and Nora held his gaze steadily, letting him see whatever he needed to see. Finally, he nodded. "There's a spare room upstairs," he said. "Used to be for Mary's mother when she'd visit. You can sleep there once the babies are down for a few hours." "Thank you." He hesitated at the stairs, one hand on the railing. "Mrs. Dale—" "Nora," she interrupted. "If I'm going to be feeding your children, you should probably call me Nora." "Nora." He tried the name out, and something about hearing it in his voice made her chest tighten. "I don't know how to thank you for this, for everything." "Just get some sleep," she said softly. "That's thanks enough." After he'd gone upstairs, Nora stood alone in the kitchen, surrounded by evidence of a man barely holding his life together, and felt something settle in her chest. Not peace. She wasn't sure she'd ever feel peaceful again. But purpose, maybe. Direction, a reason to get up tomorrow. She heated water and started washing dishes, falling into the familiar rhythm of work. The babies slept peacefully in their cradle, and overhead she could hear the creak of Wyatt's footsteps as he finally let himself rest. "I'll stay until they're stable," Nora told herself as she scrubbed dried milk from a pot. "A week, maybe 2, just until he can find someone more permanent." But even as she thought it, she knew it was another lie. Because when Lily woke 2 hours later, crying for milk, and Nora lifted her from the cradle and felt that tiny body curl against hers, felt the pull of tiny lips and the letdown of milk that finally had purpose, she knew she wasn't going anywhere. Whatever came next, however this arrangement ended, she was here now. And for the first time since they'd handed her a cold, still baby and told her to say goodbye, Nora Dale felt like maybe, just maybe, she still had something worth living for. The first week passed in a blur of feedings and diaper changes, sleep snatched in 2-hour increments, and the slow, steady work of bringing 2 babies back from the edge. Nora moved through the house like a ghost learning to be solid again, her hands remembering rhythms she'd only dreamed about during her pregnancy. The way to support a tiny head, the angle to hold a bottle when she pumped extra milk to give Wyatt a chance to feed them. The particular cry that meant hungry versus tired versus just wanting to be held. Wyatt worked the ranch during daylight hours, returning exhausted to help however he could. He was awkward with the babies at first, his large hands seeming too rough for such delicate things, but Nora showed him how to cradle them, how to burp them, how to change a diaper without sticking himself with the pins. And slowly, so slowly neither of them quite noticed when it happened, they began to move around each other with an ease that felt almost natural. "Hand me that cloth," Nora would say, elbow deep in dishwater, and Wyatt would pass it without question. "Baby's crying," Wyatt would call from the barn, and Nora would already be halfway to the cradle, her body responding before her mind caught up. They didn't talk much those first days. Both of them were too tired, too raw, too focused on survival to spare energy for conversation. But there was a companionship in the silence, a sense that they were in the trenches together, fighting the same war. The babies thrived. Within 3 days, Lily had color in her cheeks and was nursing with enthusiasm. Within 5, Jonah's jaundice began to fade, and he'd gained enough weight that his skin didn't hang loose on his tiny bones. By the end of the week, they were both sleeping in longer stretches, crying with real vigor when they wanted something, and looking up at Nora with eyes that were starting to focus. It was on the 8th day that Nora realized she hadn't thought about her own dead baby since the night she'd arrived. The realization came while she was nursing Lily in the pre-dawn darkness, Jonah sleeping peacefully in the cradle beside her. She'd been humming an old hymn her mother used to sing, watching Lily's eyes flutter closed with contentment, when the thought struck her like a physical blow. I haven't cried for him in over a week. Guilt crashed over her in waves. What kind of mother was she to forget her own son? What kind of woman moved on so quickly from a loss that should have broken her permanently? She'd held his tiny body, kissed his cold forehead, watched them lower him into ground that was frozen hard as her heart. And now here she was, 8 days later, humming hymns and feeling something dangerously close to happiness, because 2 babies who weren't hers needed her milk. Lily pulled away from the breast, fussing slightly, and Nora realized her milk had stopped flowing. Stress did that sometimes, the midwife had told her. Strong emotions could interrupt the letdown reflex. "I'm sorry," Nora whispered, adjusting Lily to the other side. "I'm sorry, sweetheart. Just give me a moment." She closed her eyes and forced herself to breathe, to relax, to let her body do what it knew how to do. And as Lily latched on again and began to drink, Nora let herself think about it properly, really think about it, for the first time since she'd walked away from her sister's house. She wasn't forgetting her son. She was surviving him. There was a difference, however fine the line. The grief was still there, would probably always be there, a weight she'd carry for the rest of her life. But it wasn't the only thing anymore. These babies, this house, this strange new purpose she'd stumbled into, they hadn't erased what she'd lost. They'd just given her a reason to keep moving forward despite it. Is that allowed? She wondered. Am I allowed to feel useful again? To feel needed? To wake up some mornings and not immediately remember that my baby is dead? She didn't know. But Lily was warm and alive against her chest, and somewhere upstairs Wyatt was sleeping peacefully for the first time in 2 weeks, and the sun was starting to paint the eastern sky with streaks of rose and gold. So maybe it didn't matter whether she was allowed or not. Maybe she was just doing what bodies do, finding ways to keep living even after the heart says it wants to stop. When Wyatt came downstairs an hour later, he found Nora in the kitchen making breakfast. Both babies were settled in their cradle, clean and fed and sleeping. The dishes were washed, the floor was swept, and there was coffee brewing on the stove. "You didn't have to do all this," he said, though his eyes showed nothing but gratitude. "Had to do something?" Nora replied, not turning from the stove where she was frying eggs. "Couldn't sleep anyway." That was true enough. She'd tried going to bed after the early feeding, but her mind had been too full, her body too restless. So she'd come down and done what her mother always did when trouble weighed heavy. She'd put the house in order. Wyatt poured himself coffee and stood by the window, looking out at his land. The sun was fully up now, revealing fields that needed work and fences that needed mending, and 100 tasks that had been neglected while he struggled to keep 2 babies alive. "I need to ride out to the western pasture today," he said quietly. "Check on the herd. I've been putting it off, but I can't anymore. Will you be all right here alone?" "We'll be fine," Nora assured him. "I managed 4 children for my sister. I think I can handle 2 babies for an afternoon." But as she said it, she felt a flutter of anxiety. Being alone with the babies felt different somehow, more permanent, more real. Like if she did this, if she took sole responsibility for these children, even for a few hours, she was admitting something she wasn't sure she was ready to admit. That she didn't want this to be temporary, that she was starting to think of this house as home. That when she looked at Wyatt Kane across the breakfast table, tired but determined, fighting his way through grief one day at a time, just like she was, she felt something stir that had nothing to do with babies or milk or Christian charity. "Don't," she told herself firmly. "Don't let yourself go there. This is an arrangement. He needs help. You have nowhere else to go. That's all this is." But her treacherous heart knew better. Chabts. Wyatt rode out mid-morning, promising to return by late afternoon. Nora watched him go from the kitchen window, then turned her attention to the tasks she'd been mentally cataloging all week. The house was clean enough now, but there was laundry that needed doing, mountains of it, and meals to prepare and babies to tend and 1,000 small repairs that a house full of grief had let slide. She was elbow-deep in laundry water, scrubbing tiny gowns and cloths, when she heard a wagon approaching. Nora straightened, wiping wet hands on her apron, and felt her stomach clench with anxiety. She wasn't sure she was ready to face visitors. Wasn't sure what she'd say if someone asked who she was or what she was doing here. But the wagon rolled past the house toward the barn, and Nora recognized the driver as one of Wyatt's ranch hands, a young man named Pete, who came by sometimes to help with the heavy work. He nodded to her politely as he passed, and Nora nodded back, relief flooding through her. Of course. He wouldn't question her presence. To him, she was just another hired hand, someone the boss had brought in to help with the babies. Simple as that. Except it wasn't simple. And when she heard another wagon later that afternoon, this one coming right up to the house, Nora knew their isolated peace was about to end. She opened the door to find Martha Simmons climbing down from her wagon, a covered basket in one hand and her face carefully arranged in what Nora recognized as charitable concern. "Mrs. Dale," Martha said, surprise evident in her voice. "I didn't expect, that is, I heard someone was helping with the babies, but I didn't realize it was you." "Mrs. Simmons," Nora replied evenly, "can I help you with something?" "I brought some things for Mr. Kane," Martha said, holding up the basket. "Some bread and preserves. We've all been so worried about those poor babies, and I thought, well, the church has been discussing what could be done to help." "The babies are fine," Nora interrupted gently but firmly. "They're healthy and gaining weight. Mr. Kane has the situation well in hand." Martha's eyes sharpened. "I see. And you're staying here? Living here?" "I'm helping with the babies," Nora said carefully. "I see," Martha said again, and this time the judgment was clear in her tone. "Well, that's very charitable of you. I'm sure Mr. Kane appreciates the help." The way she said help made it clear what she thought was really happening. Nora felt heat rise in her face, but before she could respond, one of the babies started crying inside. "I need to go," Nora said quickly. "Thank you for the basket. I'll make sure Mr. Kane gets it." She took the basket and closed the door firmly, leaning against it while her heart hammered. Behind her, she could hear Martha's wagon pulling away, and she knew with absolute certainty that by tomorrow the whole town would be talking. The grieving widow living alone with the grieving widower. No ring, no marriage, no propriety. What kind of woman does such a thing? Nora pushed away from the door and went to pick up Jonah, who'd been the one crying. She changed his diaper and settled him against her chest to nurse, trying to ignore the cold dread settling in her stomach. She'd known this would happen eventually, had known from the moment she walked through Wyatt's door that night that there would be talk, but she'd been too desperate to care then, too focused on immediate survival to think about long-term consequences. Now sitting in the quiet house with a baby at her breast, and evidence of her domestic presence everywhere, her shawl draped over the back of the chair, her sewing basket beside the hearth, her apron hanging on its hook, Nora realized just how thoroughly she'd entangled herself in Wyatt Kane's life, and how thoroughly that was going to ruin what little reputation she had left. Wyatt returned just before sunset, weary and covered in dust. He found Nora in the kitchen preparing supper, both babies asleep in their cradle. "How are things here?" he asked, washing his hands at the pump. "Fine," Nora said, not quite meeting his eyes. "Mrs. Simmons came by, brought a basket." She waited for him to ask about it, to sense the tension in her voice, but Wyatt just nodded absently and sat down at the table. He looked exhausted, she realized. Not just physically tired, but soul-deep weary in a way that went beyond mere lack of sleep. "Found 2 steers tangled in barbed wire," he said quietly. "Had to put one down. The other might make it if infection doesn't set in. Lost 3 more to wolves last month. The winter's been hard. I'm not sure—" He stopped, rubbed his face. "I'm not sure how much longer I can keep this place running." Nora set a plate of food in front of him, beans and salt pork, bread from Martha's basket. Not much, but hot and filling. "Eat," she said. "You can't fix everything on an empty stomach." He ate in silence while Nora cleaned up. The only sounds, the clink of his fork, and the occasional pop from the fire. When he finished, he pushed the plate away and looked at her directly for the first time. "I'm drowning," he said simply. "I know you see it. The ranch is falling apart. I'm barely keeping up with the most basic work. And those babies—" His voice cracked. "I love them. God help me, I love them so much it hurts. But I don't know how to do this. I don't know how to be both parents. I don't know how to grieve Mary and raise her children and keep this place from going under all at the same time." Nora sat down across from him, folding her hands on the table. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying I need help. Real help. Not just for a week or 2, but—" He met her eyes, and she saw something raw and honest there. "I can't pay you much. The ranch isn't making money right now. But if you'd consider staying on properly as a housekeeper and nurse, I'd give you room and board and whatever I can spare. And when things get better, if they get better, I'd pay you fair wages." It was a job offer. That's all it was. A perfectly reasonable arrangement between an employer and employee. So why did Nora's heart sink with something that felt dangerously like disappointment? "Because you wanted him to ask you to stay for different reasons," a voice whispered in her head. "Because you're a fool who started imagining things that were never there." "What about the talk?" she asked quietly. "Mrs. Simmons knows I'm here. By tomorrow, everyone will know. A widow living under a widower's roof." "Let them talk," Wyatt said firmly. "I'll make it clear you're employed help, that there's nothing improper happening. Anyone who has a problem with that can take it up with me directly." Nora wanted to laugh. Did he really think it would be that simple? Did he not understand how gossip worked? How quickly a woman's reputation could be shredded? How little it took for decent people to decide you were no longer decent? But when she looked at his face, at the desperate hope there, the exhaustion, the raw need, she couldn't bring herself to say no. Because where would she go if she left? Back to Helen and Victor's house, to sleep on a cot in the storage room and eat her brother-in-law's charity until even that ran out. To some room in town where she'd work herself to death washing other people's clothes and still not make enough to live on? At least here she had purpose. At least here she was needed. "All right," she heard herself say. "I'll stay. But we need to establish rules, boundaries. I'll keep to my room upstairs. You'll keep to yours. We'll treat this like the business arrangement it is." "Of course," Wyatt said quickly. "Of course. I would never—" "You have my word, Nora. I'll treat you with nothing but respect." She believed him. That was the problem. She believed every word he said, even as her foolish heart whispered that maybe, someday, she'd want more than respect. But that was a problem for future Nora. Tonight, she was just grateful to have somewhere to sleep that wasn't her sister's storage room. Tomorrow she could worry about everything else. That night, Nora lay in the spare bedroom and stared at the ceiling while moonlight painted shadows across the walls. Below her, she could hear Wyatt moving around, settling the babies for what would hopefully be a few hours of sleep before they woke hungry again. Her breasts ached, full and ready, her body already anticipating the next feeding. "This is just an arrangement," she told herself firmly. You're an employee, nothing more. But when she finally drifted off, she dreamed of a house full of children, a man with kind eyes, and a future that looked nothing like the past she was trying to leave behind. And when she woke to Lily's cry at 3 in the morning and went downstairs to find Wyatt already there, holding both babies and looking lost, something in her chest shifted irreversibly. "Here," she said, taking Lily from his arms. "Go back to bed. I'll handle this." "I can help. I know you can, but you have a long day ahead tomorrow, and I've gotten used to the schedule. Please, let me do this." He hesitated, then nodded and headed back upstairs. And Nora settled into the rocking chair with Lily at her breast, and Jonah waiting patiently in the cradle, and felt more at home than she had anywhere since her mother died. This is dangerous, she thought. This feeling, this comfort. It's going to hurt when it ends. But for tonight, in the quiet darkness with 2 babies depending on her and a man upstairs who trusted her enough to sleep, Nora let herself pretend it would never end. Let herself pretend this borrowed life might somehow become real. The talk started on a Tuesday, exactly 2 weeks after Nora had walked through Wyatt Kane's door in the middle of the night. She'd gone into town for supplies, flour, sugar, more cloth for diapers, with a list Wyatt had written out that morning, and money from the jar he kept hidden behind the loose board in the pantry. The babies had stayed home with him, finally healthy enough that Nora could leave them for a few hours without worry. She'd nursed them both before leaving, her body already calculating when she'd need to return for the next feeding. The general store fell silent when she walked in. Nora felt it immediately, that particular quality of quiet that meant people had just stopped talking about you. Martha Simmons stood by the counter with Ada Cooper and 2 other church women whose names Nora couldn't quite remember. They all turned to look at her with expressions that ranged from pity to poorly concealed judgment. "Mrs. Dale," Martha said, her voice dripping with false sweetness. "How nice to see you in town. We've all been wondering how you've been managing out at the Kane place." "I'm managing fine, thank you," Nora said evenly, moving toward the counter where Mr. Henderson stood watching the exchange with obvious discomfort. She handed him the list. "I need these items, please." "Of course, Mrs. Dale, just give me a moment to gather everything." As he moved away, Ada Cooper stepped closer, her voice pitched low enough for intimacy, but loud enough that everyone in the store could hear. "We heard you're living out there now, alone with Mr. Kane. Is that true?" "I'm employed as a nurse and housekeeper," Nora replied, keeping her tone neutral. "The babies need constant care, and Mr. Kane needs help managing the household while he works the ranch." "I see." Ada's eyebrows rose delicately. "And does this arrangement involve separate sleeping quarters?" The implication hung in the air like smoke. Nora felt heat crawl up her neck, but she forced herself to meet Ada's gaze steadily. "I have my own room. Mr. Kane has his. Everything is entirely proper." "I'm sure it is, dear," Martha interjected, though her tone suggested she was sure of no such thing. "It's just that people talk, you know. A young widow living under the same roof as a young widower, no chaperone, no family present. Well, it does raise questions about propriety." "The babies are my chaperone," Nora said sharply. "They wake every few hours through the night needing to be fed. There's no time or energy for anything improper, even if either of us were inclined toward it, which we're not." One of the other women, Mrs. Fletcher, Nora thought her name was, made a small sound that might have been a laugh or a scoff. "Still, dear, you must see how it looks." "A woman in your position, no husband, no prospects, taking up residence with a man who's barely buried his wife. I'm feeding his children," Nora interrupted, her voice rising despite her best efforts to stay calm. "Children who are starving, children nobody else in this town was willing to help. So forgive me if I'm not particularly concerned with how it looks to people who'd rather let babies die than risk a little gossip." The silence that followed was absolute. Every eye in the store fixed on Nora, and she realized with sinking certainty that she'd just made everything worse. Ladies didn't raise their voices. Ladies didn't speak so bluntly about nursing babies. Ladies certainly didn't accuse their neighbors of callousness, even when it was true. Mr. Henderson returned with her supplies wrapped in brown paper, his face carefully neutral. "That'll be $2.30, Mrs. Dale." Nora counted out the money with shaking hands, gathered her packages, and walked out of the store with her head high, even though she could feel their stares burning into her back. She made it all the way to the wagon before the tears started. Stupid, she thought furiously, swiping at her eyes. Stupid to lose your temper. Stupid to think they'd understand. Stupid to care what they think at all. But she did care. However much she tried to pretend otherwise, she cared what people thought of her. Cared that her name was being dragged through mud. That women she'd sat beside in church were now whispering about her morals. That by staying at the Kane Ranch, she'd confirmed every suspicion that she was exactly the kind of woman who'd let herself get pregnant before marriage, and then conveniently lose the baby. The ride back to the ranch felt endless. By the time Nora pulled up to the house, her breasts were aching again. She'd been gone longer than planned, upset by the encounter, and she could hear both babies crying inside. Wyatt met her at the door, Jonah in one arm and Lily in the other, both babies red-faced and furious. "Thank God you're back," he said, relief evident in his voice. "They've been crying for 20 minutes straight. I tried the sugar water, but they won't take it." "They want a nurse," Nora said, setting down her packages and reaching for Lily. The baby's cries cut off the instant she touched her, replaced by eager rooting. "Give me a few minutes with them and they'll settle." She carried both babies to the rocking chair and got them situated, one at each breast, their small bodies relaxing immediately as they began to drink. Wyatt hovered nearby, clearly wanting to help but not knowing how. "Was there trouble in town?" he asked after a moment, watching her face. Nora considered lying, then decided there was no point. He'd hear about it eventually anyway. "Martha Simmons and her friends made it clear what they think of our arrangement. Nothing we didn't expect." Wyatt's jaw tightened. "What did they say?" "The usual. Questions about propriety, implications about my character, concerns about how things look." She kept her voice light, but she couldn't quite keep the bitterness out. "Apparently I'm a fallen woman taking advantage of a grieving widower, or possibly you're taking advantage of me, or possibly we're both shameless sinners living in open scandal. The details seem to depend on who's telling the story." "Damn them," Wyatt said quietly. "Damn every one of them. Where were their concerns when these babies were dying? Where was their propriety then?" "It doesn't matter," Nora said, though they both knew it did. "Let them talk. As long as the babies are healthy and the ranch stays running, what does it matter what a bunch of church women think?" But that night, lying in her bed upstairs while the house creaked and settled around her, Nora couldn't stop replaying the scene in the store. Couldn't stop seeing the judgment in those women's eyes, hearing the insinuation in their voices. She'd been so careful these past 2 weeks, keeping to her room except when caring for the babies, maintaining strict propriety in all her interactions with Wyatt, never giving anyone cause to think anything improper was happening. And it hadn't mattered at all. They'd decided what kind of woman she was, and nothing she did would change their minds. The crying started around midnight. Not the babies this time, but deeper in the house. A man's broken sobs that carried through the thin walls and floorboards. Nora lay still for a long moment, listening, her heart clenching with an empathy she wasn't sure she had the right to feel. Wyatt was crying. Alone in his room, probably staring at the empty bed where his wife used to sleep, carrying grief too heavy to bear in daylight. Nora knew that kind of crying, had done plenty of it herself in the weeks after her baby died. The kind of weeping that came from somewhere so deep inside you that once it started, it couldn't be stopped. Only endured until it finally exhausted itself. She wanted to go to him, wanted to knock on his door and offer, what? Comfort? Understanding? The assurance that he wasn't alone in his suffering? But that would be crossing a line, and there were already too many people convinced she'd crossed all the lines that mattered. So she stayed in her bed and listened to him cry, and added his pain to the weight she carried, and wondered how much grief two people could hold before they simply broke under it. The next morning, Wyatt looked exhausted but composed, his eyes red-rimmed but dry. Neither of them mentioned what Nora had heard. They moved through their morning routines with careful courtesy, Nora nursing the babies while Wyatt made coffee, Wyatt bringing in firewood while Nora prepared breakfast, both of them maintaining the polite distance that seemed increasingly necessary as the town's suspicions grew. But 3 days later, Helen arrived. Nora was hanging laundry when she saw the wagon approaching, and her stomach sank when she recognized her sister's slight frame on the driver's seat. She hadn't seen Helen since the night she'd left, hadn't sent word about where she was or what she was doing. Part of her had hoped Helen wouldn't care enough to come looking. "Nora." Helen climbed down from the wagon, her face a mixture of concern and something harder to read. Thank God. When you disappeared in the middle of the night, Victor's been beside himself. He thought something terrible had happened to you. I'm fine, Nora said carefully, acutely aware that Wyatt was probably watching from somewhere, that the babies were inside sleeping, that everything about this moment felt precarious. I should have left a note. I'm sorry. A note? Helen's voice rose. Nora, you vanished. We looked everywhere. And then Ada Cooper's husband mentioned seeing you in town, and Martha Simmons said. She stopped, pressed her lips together. Is it true? Are you living here with Mr. Kane? I'm working here, Nora corrected, as a nurse and housekeeper. The babies needed someone to care for them, and I needed… She paused, choosing her words carefully. I needed somewhere I was useful. Helen looked at her for a long moment, and Nora saw when understanding dawned. Oh, Nora, your milk. You're nursing his babies. They were dying, Nora said simply. Nobody else would help. What was I supposed to do? You were supposed to come to me, Helen said, her voice breaking slightly. You're my sister. If you were struggling, if you needed help, I was sleeping in your storage room, Nora interrupted gently. Eating food Victor begrudged me, waiting to be told I'd overstayed my welcome. What help could you give me, Helen? What future did I have there? Helen flinched as if struck. Victor's not as bad as you think. He was just worried about money. If I'd explained, he wanted me gone. You know it as well as I do. Nora softened her tone, reaching out to touch her sister's arm. I'm not angry about it. I understand. You have your own family to think about. But this… She gestured at the house, the ranch, the life she was building here. This gives me purpose. These babies need me, and I need to be needed. But what people are saying… Helen lowered her voice. Nora, they're calling you his mistress. They're saying you moved in before his wife was cold in the ground, that you're taking advantage of his grief, that you're… She stopped, seemed unable to continue. That I'm a whore? Nora finished bluntly. Is that what they're saying? That I'm spreading my legs for a roof over my head? Nora! Helen looked scandalized. Don't talk like that. Why not? If that's what people think, I might as well say it plainly. Nora pulled the laundry basket closer, began hanging tiny gowns and cloths with sharp, angry movements. Let them think what they want. I know the truth. Wyatt knows the truth. That's all that matters. It's not all that matters, Helen insisted. Your reputation matters. Your future matters. If you stay here much longer, no decent man will ever marry you. You'll be ruined, Nora. Completely ruined. I'm already ruined, Nora said quietly. I was ruined the day I let Thomas touch me before we were married. I was ruined the day my baby came too early and died in my arms. I was ruined the day my husband got himself killed and left me with nothing. One more scandal isn't going to make much difference. Helen stared at her, tears welling in her eyes. What happened to you? You used to be so careful, so proper. Mother raised us better than this. Mother's dead, Nora said, and was surprised by how matter-of-fact she sounded. And the life she prepared us for, the one where we marry good men and keep nice houses and raise children in respectable comfort, that life wasn't meant for me. So I'm making a different one, the best I can with what I have. Before Helen could respond, the door opened and Wyatt stepped out, Lily in his arms. The baby was fussing, clearly hungry, and Nora felt her milk let down immediately at the sound. I'm sorry to interrupt, Wyatt said, his eyes moving between the two women, but Lily's ready for her feeding, and Jonah will be up soon too. Of course. Nora wiped her hands on her apron and reached for the baby. Lily quieted immediately when Nora took her, nuzzling against her chest with that instinctive seeking motion. Helen watched this exchange with an expression Nora couldn't quite read. Then her gaze shifted to Wyatt, taking in his rumpled shirt, the shadow of stubble on his jaw, the way he looked at Nora when he handed over the baby, not with lust or impropriety, but with simple, weary gratitude. Mr. Kane, Helen said carefully, I'm Helen Morrison, Nora's sister. I came to check on her welfare. Mrs. Morrison, Wyatt nodded politely. Your sister has been invaluable to my family. I don't know what we would have done without her. Yes, well. Helen's voice was stiff. That's very kind of you to say. but I'm sure you understand the position this puts her in. A young widow living in your home with no female relation present, no proper chaperone. It's bound to cause talk." "The talk's already started," Wyatt said bluntly, "and I don't much care what narrow-minded hypocrites think. Your sister is saving my children's lives. Everything else is just noise." Helen's spine stiffened. "Mr. Kane, I understand you're grateful, but you must see that Nora's reputation, her reputation was already destroyed," Wyatt interrupted. "Not by anything she did, but by this town's eagerness to judge and condemn. The same people who are whispering about her now are the ones who wouldn't lift a finger when my babies were dying. So forgive me if I don't put much stock in their opinions." The tension between them was palpable. Nora shifted Lily in her arms, feeling trapped between her sister's concern and Wyatt's fierce defense. Part of her was grateful for his words, grateful that someone finally saw past the scandal to the simple human need beneath it. But another part worried that his vehemence would only make things worse. "Helen," Nora said quietly, "I appreciate you coming, truly. But I'm staying. This is where I need to be right now." Helen looked at her for a long moment, and Nora saw the war playing out on her sister's face. Duty versus propriety, love versus fear of association with scandal. Finally, Helen's shoulders sagged. "At least write to me," she said. "Let me know you're all right. Victor may not approve, but you're still my sister. I still care what happens to you." "I will," Nora promised. "And Helen, thank you for caring enough to come." After Helen left, Nora carried Lily inside and settled into the rocking chair to nurse her. Wyatt stood by the window, watching the wagon disappear down the road, his jaw still tight with anger. "You didn't have to defend me like that," Nora said softly. "Yes, I did." He turned to face her, and his eyes were blazing. "I'm tired of people acting like you're some kind of predator taking advantage of me, or like I'm taking advantage of you. You're here because my children would have died without you. You're here because you're a good person who saw a need and met it, regardless of the cost to yourself. Anyone who can't see that is a damn fool." Nora felt something warm bloom in her chest, dangerous and hopeful. "It's going to get worse before it gets better. You know that, don't you? The more I stay, the more people will talk." "Let them talk themselves hoarse," Wyatt said roughly. "I don't care." But Nora cared. And she knew, with a certainty that settled like lead in her stomach, that this couldn't continue indefinitely. Either the scandal would force her to leave, or something would have to change to make her presence here legitimate. And she couldn't imagine what that change might look like. The days that followed were harder than the ones before. News of Helen's visit spread through town, and with it came fresh waves of speculation. Nora heard about it secondhand through Pete, the ranch hand, who reported with obvious discomfort that people were saying Mrs. Dale had refused to leave despite her own sister's pleas, that Mr. Kane was clearly under some kind of spell, that those poor babies were being raised in a house of sin. "They're saying maybe someone should report it to the territorial authorities," Pete said reluctantly, his hat in his hands. "Marshal Thompson's been asking questions about whether there's any impropriety happening, whether the babies are being properly cared for." Wyatt's face darkened. "Let him come ask me directly if he has concerns. The babies are healthy, the house is clean, and everything is entirely proper. Anyone who suggests otherwise is a liar." But Nora could see the worry creeping in around his eyes, could see him calculating how long they could maintain this arrangement before external pressure became too much to bear. She wondered the same thing herself as she went through her daily routines, nursing, cleaning, cooking, caring for two babies who were thriving under her attention. How long before someone decided to intervene? How long before her presence here did more harm than good? The answer came sooner than she expected. It was a Thursday afternoon when Nora heard horses approaching, several of them, moving fast. She was in the kitchen with both babies in their cradle beside her, Wyatt out working the far pasture. Something about the urgency of those hoofbeats made her stomach clench with dread. She moved to the window and felt her heart sink. 5 riders, led by a man in a black coat she recognized as Deacon Hill from the church. Behind him rode Marshal Thompson, Ada Cooper's husband George, and 2 other men she didn't know. Nora's first instinct was to run, to grab the babies and hide, to pretend she wasn't here. But that was foolish. Where would she go? And besides, she'd done nothing wrong. Nothing except try to keep two babies alive. She opened the door before they could knock, standing in the doorway with her chin high and her hands folded calmly in front of her, even though her heart was racing. "Deacon Hill," she said evenly, "Marshall Thompson. What can I do for you gentlemen?" "Mrs. Dale?" Deacon Hill's voice was grave, his expression one of pained concern that looked rehearsed. "We've come to discuss a matter of some delicacy. May we come in?" "Mr. Kane isn't here at the moment," Nora said. "Perhaps you should return when he's home." "Actually, it's you we came to speak with," Marshall Thompson said. His voice was gruff but not unkind. "We've had complaints, Mrs. Dale. Serious complaints about the situation here." "Complaints about what exactly?" Nora kept her voice steady even as panic began to build. "The babies are healthy. The house is clean. I'm employed as a nurse and housekeeper. What complaints could anyone possibly have?" "The complaints concern the propriety of the arrangement," Deacon Hill said smoothly. "A young widow living alone with a young widower, no chaperone present, no family oversight. Surely you can understand how this appears to the community." "It appears that I'm keeping two babies alive," Nora said sharply. "It appears that I'm doing work nobody else was willing to do." "No one is questioning your dedication to the children," Deacon Hill continued. "But we must consider the example being set. The moral implications." "The moral implications?" Nora's voice rose despite her best efforts. "Where were your moral concerns when these babies were starving? Where was the community's dedication then?" George Cooper shifted uncomfortably. "Mrs. Dale, nobody's saying you did wrong to help, but the way you're helping, living here day and night, no proper oversight, it's causing scandal. And scandal affects more than just you and Mr. Kane. It affects the whole community." "So what exactly are you suggesting?" Nora demanded. "That I should leave? Let the babies starve so the community can feel virtuous?" "There are other solutions," Deacon Hill said. "We've taken the liberty of arranging for a more suitable situation. Mrs. Adelaide Porter is a widow herself, a respectable woman of mature years who has offered to move in as housekeeper and nurse. She can provide the care the children need without the appearance of impropriety." The words hit Nora like a physical blow. They'd already found her replacement, already decided she was expendable. All of this, the visit, the speech about morality, was just theater, a performance of concern before they swept her aside. "Does Mr. Kane know about this arrangement?" she asked, her voice dangerously quiet. "We thought it best to approach you first," Deacon Hill said, "to give you the opportunity to make this decision yourself, rather than forcing Mr. Kane to choose between his reputation and his gratitude to you." "How generous," Nora said bitterly. Behind her, one of the babies started crying. Jonah, from the sound of it, his cry was slightly deeper than Lily's. Nora's breasts responded immediately, milk letting down, and she felt the familiar wetness spread across her bodice. "I need to tend to the baby," she said tightly. "Of course," Deacon Hill said. "We'll wait." "No." Nora stepped back, one hand on the door. "You'll leave. If Mr. Kane wants to discuss staffing arrangements for his household, he can do so when he returns. But I'm not going to stand here and be lectured about morality by men who let babies cry themselves sick rather than risk a little gossip." She closed the door firmly before they could respond, her hands shaking so badly she had to lean against the wood for support. Behind her, Jonah's cries intensified, and she forced herself to move, to pick him up, to get him settled at her breast while her mind raced. "They're going to take this away from me," she thought wildly. "They're going to take these babies, this purpose, this fragile sense of belonging I've built, and they're going to hand it to some stranger because I dared to be improper." She was still nursing Jonah when Wyatt came home an hour later. He took one look at her face and went still. "What happened?" "They came," Nora said numbly. "Deacon Hill, the marshal, some others. They found a replacement for me, a Mrs. Porter, respectable, mature, properly moral. They want me gone." Wyatt's face went white, then red. "They what?" "They said I'm causing scandal, that the situation here is improper. They've arranged for this Mrs. Porter to move in and take over my duties so you can maintain your reputation." "To hell with my reputation," Wyatt said roughly. He moved to her side, crouching down so he was level with her chair. "Nora, I don't want some stranger taking care of my children. I don't want you to leave." "It doesn't matter what we want," Nora said, and was horrified to hear her voice break. They've already decided. And maybe they're right. Maybe I've been selfish staying here, knowing what people would say. Stop. Wyatt's hands closed over hers where they rested on Jonah's small back. Don't let them make you doubt yourself. You've done nothing but good here, nothing but keep my family alive. But they're right about one thing, Nora said quietly. This situation, it can't continue as it is. Eventually something has to give. Either I leave or... She trailed off, unable to finish the thought. Or we make it legitimate, she thought, but couldn't say. Or you marry me and make me your wife instead of your employee, and then nobody can say anything. But that was a fantasy. Wyatt Kane didn't want her that way. He needed her milk, needed her domestic skills, needed her help keeping his life from falling apart. But that wasn't the same as wanting her. And even if he did consider marriage, it would only be out of obligation, to give her protection, to shut up the gossips. Not because he loved her, and Nora had already been in one marriage based on obligation. She wouldn't survive another. We'll figure something out, Wyatt said, but his voice lacked conviction. He pulled his hands away and stood, running them through his hair in frustration. I'll talk to Deacon Hill, explain that we have an arrangement that works, that there's no need for changes. They won't listen, Nora interrupted gently. They've already made up their minds. That night, Nora packed her carpet bag. Not all the way. She wasn't leaving yet, but enough that she'd be ready when the time came, when Mrs. Porter arrived and took over the feeding of the babies, took over the running of the house, took over the place Nora had carved out for herself in this broken family. She folded her spare dress carefully, wrapped her mother's Bible in a clean cloth, looked at the patchwork quilt she'd been working on in her spare moments, squares of fabric salvaged from worn-out clothes, stitched together into something new. She'd thought about giving it to Wyatt for the babies when it was finished. Now she supposed Mrs. Porter would be the one to cover them with it. I knew this was temporary, she told herself firmly. I knew I was just filling a gap until something more permanent could be arranged. This isn't a surprise. This isn't a betrayal. This is just reality catching up. But it felt like both those things anyway. Mrs. Adelaide Porter arrived on Saturday in a carriage so polished, it looked like it had never seen a day of honest work. She was everything Nora wasn't. Older, refined, dressed in mourning silk that spoke of money and social standing. Her gray hair was swept back in an elegant knot, her posture perfect, her smile practiced and cold as January ice. Nora watched from the kitchen window as Wyatt went out to greet her, Deacon Hill climbing down from the driver's seat with the air of a man who'd just delivered salvation. Her hands were elbow-deep in dishwater, Lily sleeping in the cradle beside her, and Jonah just beginning to stir for his next feeding. She'd nursed them both an hour ago, but already her breasts were full again, her body stubbornly insisting on its purpose even as that purpose was being stripped away. Mrs. Porter, welcome, she heard Wyatt say, his voice carefully neutral. Though I'm not sure there's been a misunderstanding. I haven't agreed to any changes in my household arrangements. Mr. Kane, Deacon Hill's voice carried through the open window. We discussed this. Mrs. Dale's presence here is causing scandal that reflects poorly on you, your children, and the entire community. Mrs. Porter has graciously offered to take over the household duties in a manner that won't raise eyebrows or damage reputations. My household duties are being performed admirably already, Wyatt said, and Nora heard the edge in his voice. The babies are healthy, the house is running smoothly, I see no reason for change. The reason is propriety, Mrs. Porter said, and her voice was surprisingly warm, almost maternal. Mr. Kane, I understand you're grateful to Mrs. Dale for her help during a difficult time, but surely you can see how this situation appears to others. A young woman, recently widowed herself, living alone with you. It invites speculation that can only harm your family in the long run. The only thing harming my family is busybodies who care more about appearances than they do about my children's welfare, Wyatt shot back. Mr. Kane, please. Mrs. Porter's tone turned gentle, coaxing. I'm not here to criticize Mrs. Dale or to cause trouble. I'm here to offer a solution that benefits everyone. I have experience caring for infants. I raised 4 of my own. I can provide the same level of care Mrs. Dale has been providing, but without the unfortunate implications. The babies need to nurse, Wyatt said flatly. Mrs. Dale is feeding them. Can you do that? There was a pause, and Nora could imagine Mrs. Porter's carefully composed expression faltering slightly. Well, no, of course not, but we can transition them to cow's milk, or find a wet nurse in town who can come by daily. We tried cow's milk, Wyatt interrupted. They were dying on it, and no one in town was willing to nurse them before. What makes you think they'd be willing now? I'm sure if we offer adequate compensation, no. Wyatt's voice was firm. I appreciate the offer, Mrs. Porter, but my answer is no. Mrs. Dale stays. If that causes scandal, then the scandal is the community's problem, not mine. Nora's heart leaped at his words, hope and gratitude flooding through her in equal measure. But then Deacon Hill spoke again, and his voice carried a weight that made her go cold. Mr. Kane, I'm afraid this isn't entirely your decision to make. There have been formal complaints filed with Marshall Thompson regarding the moral environment in which your children are being raised. If you refuse to make changes voluntarily, the territorial authorities may need to intervene to ensure the children's welfare. The silence that followed was terrible. Nora pressed one hand to her mouth, fighting nausea. They were threatening to take the babies away, to claim that Wyatt was an unfit father because he'd allowed an improper woman into his home. It was exactly the kind of moral crusading that destroyed lives while pretending to save souls. You wouldn't dare, Wyatt said, but his voice had lost its certainty. No one wants it to come to that, Deacon Hill said smoothly, which is why Mrs. Porter's offer is so providential. Accept her help, allow Mrs. Dale to return to town where she can rebuild her life in more appropriate circumstances, and all concerns will be laid to rest. Your children will be cared for, your reputation will be protected, and everyone can move forward. Nora didn't wait to hear Wyatt's response. She couldn't bear it, couldn't stand there knowing he was being forced to choose between her and his children's safety. She dried her hands quickly, checked that both babies were still sleeping, and slipped out the back door. She made it to the barn before the tears started, harsh sobs that tore from her chest like something physical being ripped away. She'd known this was coming, had known from the moment Deacon Hill showed up that her time here was limited. But knowing it and facing it were two different things, and the reality of losing these babies, these children who'd somehow become hers over the past month, was more than she could bear standing upright. She sank down onto a hay bale, buried her face in her hands, and let herself break. That was where Wyatt found her 20 minutes later. She heard his boots on the barn floor and tried to compose herself, but it was useless. Her eyes were swollen, her face blotchy, and she couldn't seem to stop the hitching breaths that kept escaping despite her best efforts. Nora. He crouched in front of her, and when she finally looked up at him, his face was ravaged. I'm so sorry. I tried to send them away, but Hill made it clear. They'll take the babies if I don't comply. They'll claim I'm providing an immoral environment, get some judge to rule me unfit, and place Jonah and Lily with another family. I can't risk that. I can't lose them. I know, Nora whispered. I know. You have to do what's best for your children. I understand. I don't want you to leave, Wyatt said roughly. You have to know that. These past weeks, you've made this house feel like a home again. The babies are thriving because of you. I'm surviving because of you. The thought of some stranger coming in. Mrs. Porter seems competent, Nora interrupted, trying to keep her voice steady. I'm sure she'll take good care of them. But she's not you. The words hung in the air between them, weighted with meaning neither of them knew how to address. Nora wanted to ask what he meant by that, whether he valued her specifically or just the service she provided, whether he'd miss her as a person or just as a convenient solution to his domestic problems. But she was too afraid of the answer, so she said nothing. How long do I have? She asked instead. He'll want you gone by tomorrow. Wyatt's jaw tightened. He's giving Mrs. Porter the room upstairs, your room. She's already started unpacking. Of course she had. Why waste time when there was a fallen woman to be displaced and a household to be properly reformed? Nora felt something cold and hard settle in her chest, replacing the tears with a kind of numb acceptance. I'll need to nurse them one more time, she said quietly, to tide them over until Mrs. Porter can arrange for cow's milk or find a wet nurse. And I should probably express some milk, show her how to feed them with a bottle, in case. Nora, stop. Wyatt's hands closed over hers, warm and rough and real. Stop being so damn practical about this. You're allowed to be angry. You're allowed to fall apart. I did fall apart, she said, gesturing at her tear-stained face. In your barn. Very dignified. Now I need to pull myself together and figure out what comes next. What does come next? Wyatt asked. Where will you go? Nora had been trying not to think about that. There's a boarding house in town. Mrs. Chen runs it. She might have a room available. And I can look for work. Washing, mending, whatever needs doing. I'll give you money, Wyatt said immediately. Wages for the work you've done here. It's not much, but it should tide you over until— You don't owe me anything, Nora interrupted. I came here because I needed to, because my body was making milk for a baby who was dead and your babies needed milk to live. It was as much for me as it was for you. That doesn't make it not work, Wyatt argued. You've been keeping my house, caring for my children, doing labor that deserves compensation. Please, let me at least do this. Nora nodded, too tired to argue. All right, thank you. They sat in silence for a moment, the barn settling around them with small sounds, horses shifting in their stalls, chickens murmuring, the wind whistling through gaps in the boards. It felt like the last moment of peace before everything changed irreversibly. I should go back, Nora said finally. The babies will wake soon. I need to feed them before— She couldn't finish the sentence, before she left them forever, before she handed them over to a stranger and walked away from the only purpose she'd found since her own baby died. Wyatt helped her to her feet, and for just a moment they stood close enough that Nora could feel the warmth of him, smell the scent of leather and hay and honest work. She wondered what it would be like to lean into that warmth, to let herself be held by someone who might actually care whether she stayed or went. But that was foolish thinking, dangerous and pointless, so she stepped back and smoothed her skirts and put on the composed expression that had gotten her through every other loss. Mrs. Porter was in the kitchen when they returned, examining the stove with a critical eye. She turned as they entered, and her gaze flickered between them with sharp assessment before she smiled that practiced smile again. Mrs. Dale, she said warmly, Mr. Kane has told me about your invaluable assistance during this difficult time. The children are fortunate to have had your care. Thank you, Nora said evenly. They're good babies, strong. They should do well on cow's milk once you make the transition. I'm sure they will, Mrs. Porter agreed. Though I understand you've been nursing them. That will need to stop gradually, I suppose. Perhaps you could express milk for a few days while their stomachs adjust. The casual dismissal of what Nora had been doing, the way Mrs. Porter spoke about nursing as if it were just another household task that could be handed off like laundry or cooking, made something flare hot in Nora's chest. But she swallowed it down. I'll feed them one more time tonight and again in the morning before I leave, she said. After that, you'll need to manage as best you can. Mrs. Porter's eyebrows rose slightly. I see. Well, I'm sure we'll manage just fine. I've raised 4 children of my own, after all. On cow's milk? Nora asked before she could stop herself. On my own milk, actually, Mrs. Porter said, and there was a hint of steel beneath the warmth now. So I do understand the bond that nursing creates, but surely you can see that bond is temporary in your case. These children aren't yours, Mrs. Dale. It's better for everyone if the attachment is severed cleanly. They're not yours either, Nora shot back, but at least I don't pretend my presence here is about anything but money and reputation. Nora, Wyatt started, but Mrs. Porter held up a hand. It's all right, Mr. Kane. Mrs. Dale is understandably emotional. I don't take offense. She turned back to Nora, and her expression softened into something that might have been genuine sympathy. I know this is difficult. You've bonded with these babies during a time when you were grieving your own loss. But staying here, continuing this arrangement, it's not healthy for you or for them. Sometimes the kindest thing we can do is let go. The worst part was that Mrs. Porter wasn't wrong. Nora had been using these babies to fill a hole that couldn't be filled, using their need to avoid facing her own grief, using this house to hide from a future that terrified her. Staying here indefinitely wouldn't heal her. It would just delay the inevitable reckoning. But knowing that didn't make leaving hurt any less. I need to nurse them, Nora said quietly. Excuse me. She took Jonah from the cradle and settled into the rocking chair with her back to Mrs. Porter, creating what little privacy she could. The baby latched on eagerly, and Nora felt the familiar pull, the letdown, the sense of her body finally doing what it was made for. She closed her eyes and tried to memorize everything, the The weight of Jonah in her arms, the small sucking sounds he made, the way his tiny hand curled against her breast, trusting and content. Behind her, she could hear Wyatt and Mrs. Porter discussing household arrangements in low voices, where things were kept, what the baby's schedule had been, how much milk they typically consumed. Practical matters, easily transferred from one caretaker to another, as if Nora had never been here at all. That night was the longest of Nora's life. She nursed both babies every time they woke, knowing each feeding might be her last. She memorized their faces in the lamplight, Lily's dark lashes, Jonah's rosebud mouth, the way they both sighed with contentment when their bellies were full. She whispered to them things she'd never said aloud, promises she had no right to make. "I won't forget you," she told Lily during the 3 a.m. feeding, "even if you forget me. Even if you grow up calling someone else Mama. I'll always remember that you were mine for a little while. That you gave me a reason to keep breathing when I didn't think I could." Lily's eyes were closed, her small fist resting against Nora's chest, and she looked so peaceful that Nora's throat closed with unshed tears. "Be good for Mrs. Porter," she continued, her voice barely a whisper. "Drink your milk and grow strong and have a beautiful life. And if you ever wonder, if you ever feel like something's missing, I loved you. I want you to know that. Someone loved you with every broken piece of her heart." When morning came, Nora dressed in her best remaining dress, which wasn't saying much, and packed her carpet bag with the few possessions she'd brought. The patchwork quilt was nearly finished now, just a few more squares to attach, and she left it folded on the bed for Wyatt to do with as he pleased. Maybe he'd give it to Mrs. Porter to use. Maybe he'd put it away in a trunk and forget about it. Either way, it didn't belong to Nora anymore. Nothing here belonged to her. She'd been foolish to forget that, even for a moment. She nursed the babies one final time in the pre-dawn darkness, trying not to think about how this was goodbye, trying not to imagine them crying for her later, confused about why the familiar warmth and comfort had suddenly disappeared. Mrs. Porter would feed them cow's milk from bottles, and they'd be hungry and upset at first, but eventually they'd adjust. Babies were resilient that way. They adapted to whatever circumstances life handed them. It was the adults who couldn't seem to let go. Wyatt was waiting downstairs with her wages, more money than she'd expected, enough to cover several weeks at the boarding house. "I wish it was more," he said quietly, pressing the bills into her hand. "I wish—" He stopped, seemed to struggle with words. "Thank you, for everything. I know that's inadequate, but I don't have better words." "It's enough," Nora said, though it wasn't. Nothing would be enough. "Take care of them, that's all I ask." "I will, I promise." Mrs. Porter appeared in the kitchen doorway, already dressed and competent-looking, and Nora felt like a ghost being replaced by something solid and real. "Safe travels, Mrs. Dale," she said pleasantly. "I hope you find a situation that suits you better." Nora didn't trust herself to respond. She picked up her carpet bag, took one last look at the cradle where the babies slept, and walked out the door before her resolve could crumble. Wyatt insisted on driving her into town in the wagon, and they made the journey in painful silence. What was there to say? They'd both made the only choices available to them, and those choices had led here, to a wagon rolling through the cold morning toward a future neither of them wanted. Mrs. Chen's boarding house was a narrow 2-story building on the edge of town, respectable enough but clearly struggling. The paint was peeling, the steps needed repair, and the windows looked like they hadn't been properly cleaned in months. But Mrs. Chen herself was kind when she answered the door, a tiny Chinese woman with steel gray hair and eyes that saw too much. "Yes?" she asked, looking between Nora and Wyatt. "I'm looking for a room," Nora said, "and possibly work if you need help with the house." Mrs. Chen studied her for a long moment, and Nora had the uncomfortable feeling of being assessed and cataloged and understood in a way that stripped away all pretense. Finally, Mrs. Chen nodded. "I have a room, small but clean, $5 a week, includes 2 meals. If you work for me, cooking, cleaning, laundry, I take off $2 from rent. You keep any tips from boarders." "I'll take it," Nora said immediately. "Good." Mrs. Chen stepped back to let her in. "3rd floor, last door on right. Bring your bag, I show you." Wyatt set Nora's carpet bag down inside the door, and for a moment they just stood there, neither knowing how to say goodbye. Finally, Wyatt pulled an envelope from his pocket. "This is for you," he said quietly. "A reference letter, in case you need work elsewhere. It explains that you were employed as a nurse and housekeeper, that you performed your duties admirably, and that I'd recommend you without reservation to anyone seeking similar help." Nora took the envelope with shaking hands. "Thank you. That's very kind. It's the truth." Wyatt's voice was rough. "Nora, if circumstances were different, if this town wasn't so damn set on propriety—" "I know," Nora interrupted gently, "but circumstances are what they are. You have to protect your children. I understand." He nodded, but his face looked stricken, and Nora realized with a jolt that this was hurting him too, that she wasn't the only one losing something valuable here. But recognizing that didn't change anything. It just made the goodbye harder. "I should go," Wyatt said finally. "Mrs. Porter will need help with the morning feeding, and I've got work to do on the ranch." "Of course, go. They need you." He hesitated one more moment, looking like he wanted to say something else, then simply nodded and walked back to his wagon. Nora watched through the window as he drove away, and only when he disappeared around the corner did she let herself collapse against the wall and press both hands against her chest, trying to hold in the pieces of her heart that felt like they were shattering. "Come," Mrs. Chen said from the stairs, her voice not unkind. "I show you room, then you rest. Grief is heavy work. Need rest to carry it." The room was exactly as advertised, small and clean, with a narrow bed, a washstand, and a single window that looked out over the alley. It was nothing like the room she'd had at the Kane Ranch, nothing like the home she'd briefly thought might be hers. But it was shelter, and it was honest work, and it was hers in a way that the ranch had never really been. Nora set her carpet bag on the bed and sat down beside it, her hands automatically going to her breasts. They were heavy and hot, full of milk that had nowhere to go now. By tomorrow they'd be even fuller, painfully engorged. By the next day her body would start to realize that no one needed its milk anymore and begin the process of drying up. The thought made her want to scream. Instead, she lay down on the narrow bed, curled into herself like a child, and finally, let herself cry for everything she'd lost. Her baby, her husband, her brief shining moment of being needed. The two children who'd made her body's stubborn insistence on motherhood make sense. She cried until there were no tears left, until her head pounded and her chest ached and exhaustion dragged her down into sleep. And when she woke hours later to the sound of footsteps in the hall, and the smell of cooking from downstairs, and the painful throb of breasts swollen with milk no one wanted, Nora forced herself to sit up and smooth her hair and wash her face. She'd survived worse than this. She'd buried a husband and a baby. She'd walked away from her sister's house with nothing but a carpet bag in desperation. She'd offered herself as a wet nurse to a stranger in the middle of the night. She could survive this too. She had to. The boarding house was quiet that first evening, just Nora and two other residents, a traveling salesman who kept to himself, and an elderly woman Mrs. Chen introduced as Miss Sarah, who'd lived there for 20 years. Nora helped Mrs. Chen prepare dinner, grateful for the familiar rhythms of chopping vegetables and stirring pots, and tried not to think about what was happening at the Kane Ranch right now. Were the babies crying? Were they refusing the cow's milk as they had before Nora arrived? Was Mrs. Porter managing, or was Wyatt pacing the floor with two screaming infants, regretting his decision to let Nora go? "Stop," Mrs. Chen said quietly, pausing beside Nora at the stove. "Thinking about what cannot be changed only makes the hurt worse. Focus on what is here, what is now." "I don't know how," Nora admitted. "Practice," Mrs. Chen said simply. "Every day practice. Eventually, maybe, it gets easier." But 3 days later, lying awake at 3 in the morning while her breasts leaked milk onto sheets she'd have to wash, listening to some couple argue in the room below and missing the sound of babies crying, Nora wasn't sure it would ever get easier. She was working in the kitchen the next morning, her hands raw from scrubbing floors, when she heard a commotion in the parlor. Raised voices, one of them familiar, one she'd know anywhere even though she'd only known him a few weeks. Nora rushed to the doorway and stopped dead. Wyatt Kane stood in Mrs. Chen's parlor, his clothes disheveled, his eyes wild, and both babies in his arms. Both of them were crying, Not the weak mewling of before, but strong, furious, desperate crying that seemed to echo off every wall. "I need Nora," he was saying to Mrs. Chen, his voice ragged. "Mrs. Dale, is she here? I need her, please." "Mr. Kane." Nora stepped forward, her heart hammering. "What's wrong? What happened?" He turned to her, and the relief on his face was so profound it took her breath away. "They won't eat," he said hoarsely. "For 3 days I've tried everything. Cow's milk, goat's milk, sugar water. Mrs. Porter tried, the doctor tried, I tried. They just keep crying. They're getting weaker again, Nora. I can't lose them. Please." As if they'd heard her voice, both babies turned their faces toward her, and Nora saw it. The recognition, the desperate seeking. They knew her. They remembered. And they wanted their mother, not the woman who'd given birth to them and died. Not Mrs. Porter with her competence and propriety. Her. The woman whose body had kept them alive, whose arms had held them through their first fragile weeks, whose voice had whispered promises in the dark. "Give them to me," Nora said, her voice shaking. The moment Wyatt placed Lily in her arms, the baby's cries cut off like a switch had been flipped. Lily nuzzled against Nora's chest, rooting frantically, and Nora's milk let down so fast it soaked through her dress in seconds. "Upstairs," Mrs. Chen said quietly. "3rd floor, last door. Go." Nora didn't need to be told twice. She took the stairs as fast as she dared with a baby in her arms, Wyatt following with Jonah still crying desperately. In her small room, she sat on the bed and immediately began unbuttoning her dress with one hand while supporting Lily with the other. The baby latched on with a ferocity that made Nora gasp, and the relief was so intense it brought tears to her eyes. Lily drank like she'd been dying of thirst, great gulping swallows that spoke of 3 days of deprivation and desperation. "Here," Nora said, reaching for Jonah. "Give him to me." Wyatt passed over the boy, and Nora got him situated at her other breast. His latch was weaker than his sister's. He'd lost weight again, she could feel it. But once he started drinking, he didn't stop. And in the sudden silence, with both babies nursing peacefully, and Wyatt standing there staring at them like they were a miracle, Nora finally let herself ask the question that mattered. "What are you doing here, Wyatt? You can't keep doing this. You can't keep bringing them to me every few days for feeding and then taking them back. It's not fair to them, and it's not fair to me. And eventually someone's going to report you for it anyway." "I know," Wyatt said roughly. He sank down onto the floor beside the bed, his back against the wall, and ran both hands through his hair. "I know, I didn't know what else to do. Mrs. Porter tried everything. She's experienced, competent, everything she claimed to be. But the babies just kept refusing. They'd take a little milk and then spit it up. They'd cry until they exhausted themselves and then wake up an hour later still hungry. By yesterday, they weren't even crying anymore. They were just giving up." Nora's heart clenched at the image. 2 tiny babies so exhausted from crying and hunger that they'd stopped fighting. She looked down at them now, nursing with single-minded determination, and felt something fierce and protective rise in her chest. "So what now?" she asked quietly. "I feed them once and you take them back to Mrs. Porter? We repeat this whole nightmare in another few days?" "No." Wyatt's voice was firm, and when she looked at him, his eyes held something she'd never seen there before, determination mixed with what looked like fear. "I told Mrs. Porter to leave, paid her for the week and sent her back to town this morning. Deacon Hill is going to have my head, and the whole community is probably sharpening their pitchforks. But I don't care anymore. I can't watch my children die to satisfy someone else's idea of propriety." "They'll take the babies away," Nora said, even as hope began to flutter dangerously in her chest. "You said it yourself. They threatened to claim you're an unfit father if you didn't comply." "Let them try." Wyatt's jaw set in a hard line. "I'll fight them in every court in the territory if I have to. These are my children, and nobody, not Deacon Hill, not the marshal, not the whole damn town, is going to tell me I can't do what's necessary to keep them alive." Lily had fallen asleep at Nora's breast, milk-drunk and peaceful, her tiny face finally relaxed. Nora carefully detached her and passed her to Wyatt, then adjusted Jonah to a better position. The boy was still drinking, making up for 3 days of near starvation, and Nora could feel her body responding with that familiar sense of purpose. "I can't just come back to the ranch," she said, forcing herself to be practical even as her heart screamed at her to say yes to anything he asked. "Not as your employee. Not after Mrs. Porter. The scandal would be 10 times worse." "I know." Wyatt cradled Lily against his chest, looking down at her sleeping face with such tenderness it made Nora's throat tight. "Which is why I'm not asking you to come back as my employee." The room fell silent except for Jonah's small sucking sounds. Nora's heart was beating so hard she could hear it in her ears. "What are you asking then?" she whispered. Wyatt looked up at her, and his eyes held everything: exhaustion, desperation, hope, and something else, something that looked almost like longing. "I'm asking you to marry me." The words hung in the air between them, impossible and obvious all at once. Nora stared at him, her mind racing through 1,000 responses and landing on none of them. "That's not—" she started, then stopped. "You can't—" "Wyatt, you can't marry me just to solve a scandal. That's not a reason to get married." "It's not just about the scandal," he said quietly, "though I won't pretend that's not part of it. If you're my wife, nobody can say anything. The babies would have a mother, legally, properly. You'd have a home and protection and a place you belong. It solves everything." "Except it doesn't," Nora said, and was surprised by how steady her voice came out despite the chaos in her chest. "Because you're talking about a marriage of convenience, a practical arrangement to satisfy the town and give the babies stability. But Wyatt, I've already been in one marriage that was just an obligation. One marriage where I was the solution to a problem instead of someone actually wanted. I can't do that again. I won't." Wyatt's face went still. "You think I don't want you?" "I think you're grateful to me," Nora said carefully. "I think you need help with your children and your household. I think you're a decent man who wants to do right by everyone. But that's not the same as wanting to build a life with someone. That's not the same as—" She couldn't say it, couldn't put words to what she actually wanted from him, because saying it out loud would make it real and vulnerable and dangerous. "Not the same as what?" Wyatt pressed. "As loving you?" Nora's breath caught. Jonah had finished nursing and fallen asleep like his sister, and she carefully buttoned her dress with shaking hands, using the task to avoid looking at Wyatt's face. "You don't love me," she said quietly. "You barely know me. We've spent a few weeks living in the same house, working together to keep your children alive. That's not love. That's partnership. That's survival." "Then what would you call it?" Wyatt shifted Lily to one arm and reached out with his free hand to catch Nora's wrist, stopping her nervous fidgeting with her buttons. "What would you call the fact that I haven't slept properly since you left because the house feels empty without you? That I kept finding myself turning to ask you something only to remember you weren't there? That watching Mrs. Porter try to do the things you did made me realize how much of my life you'd quietly taken on without me even noticing?" "Gratitude," Nora whispered. "Appreciation for someone who made your life easier." "No." His grip on her wrist tightened. "It's more than that. I watch you with my children, and I see someone who loves them like they're her own. I listen to you talk, and I realize you're one of the smartest, strongest people I've ever met. I see you working yourself to exhaustion, giving everything you have without asking for anything in return. And I think, God, I think I don't deserve someone this good. But I want you anyway. Not because you're convenient, not because you solve my problems, but because when I imagine the rest of my life, I can't picture it without you in it." Tears were streaming down Nora's face now, and she couldn't have stopped them if she tried. "You're just saying that because the babies need me." "The babies need you," Wyatt agreed, "but I need you too. Maybe I'm doing this all wrong. Maybe I should have courted you properly, waited a respectable amount of time, followed all the rules society says matter. But my wife just died. Your husband just died. We're both drowning in grief and responsibility, and somewhere in the middle of all that darkness, I found someone who made me remember what it feels like to hope." Is that love? I don't know. I've only been in love once before, and that was different, younger, easier, built over years instead of weeks. But I know I don't want to lose you. I know I want to wake up every morning with you in my house. I know I want to build a life where we raise these children together, and maybe someday have more children if God's willing, and grow old sitting on that porch watching our grandchildren play. So if that's not love, it's close enough for me." Nora was sobbing now, great heaving sobs that shook her whole body. Wyatt set Lily carefully in the cradle of a blanket on the bed and took Jonah from Nora's arms to lay beside his sister. Then he pulled Nora against his chest and just held her while she broke apart. "I'm so tired of being alone," she gasped against his shirt. "I'm so tired of pretending I'm strong enough to handle everything by myself. I want someone to come home to. I want to matter to someone beyond what I can do for them. I want to be chosen, Wyatt. Actually chosen, not just convenient." "Then choose me back," he said roughly. "Choose this life we could build together. Choose these babies who already love you. Choose me, even though I'm a mess and my ranch is falling apart, and I can't promise you anything except that I'll try my damnedest to make you happy." Nora pulled back enough to look up at him, and what she saw in his face made her heart stutter. He meant it, every word. This wasn't obligation or gratitude or desperate problem-solving. This was a man who'd looked at her, really looked at her, past the scandal and the grief and the broken pieces, and decided she was worth choosing anyway. "What if it doesn't work?" she whispered. "What if we're both just too damaged, too grief-stricken, too desperate to make good decisions? What if we wake up in 6 months or a year and realize we've made a terrible mistake?" "Then we'll deal with it," Wyatt said. "Together. That's what marriage is, isn't it? Choosing to face whatever comes side by side, even when it's hard. Especially when it's hard." Nora thought about her first marriage, the rushed wedding when she was 3 months pregnant, the shame that colored every day after, the way Thomas had looked at her sometimes like she'd trapped him into a life he never wanted. She thought about her baby, born too early and too small, slipping away before she'd even gotten to know him. She thought about the weeks of grief that followed, the emptiness that seemed to stretch forward into an endless future of nothing mattering. And then she thought about walking into Wyatt's house that night, her breasts aching with milk and her heart aching with purpose. She thought about the first time Lily latched on and color returned to her tiny face. She thought about Wyatt teaching her how to burp a baby properly, his big hands so gentle. She thought about sitting in the rocking chair at 3 a.m, nursing a baby while dawn painted the sky pink, and feeling, for the first time in forever, like maybe she wasn't entirely broken. "I choose you," she heard herself say. "God help us both. But I choose you." Wyatt's breath left him in a rush, and then he was kissing her, desperate and grateful and tender all at once. It wasn't Nora's first kiss, but it felt like it. Felt like something entirely new and terrifying and right. When they pulled apart, both breathing hard, he rested his forehead against hers. "We should do this properly," he said. "Get a license, find a preacher, make it legal before I take you home." "The scandal will be even worse if we wait," Wyatt finished. "But if we're married, if it's done and official and blessed by the church, what can they say? A widower remarries. A widow finds a new home. 2 grieving people find comfort in each other and provide a stable home for orphaned children. It's respectable enough if we make it so." Nora thought about Deacon Hill's face when he learned about this, about Martha Simmons and Ada Cooper and all the other women who'd been so quick to judge her. Part of her wanted to hide, to slink off and get married quietly where no one could see and whisper. But another part, the part that had walked into Wyatt's house in the middle of the night, the part that had stood in his kitchen and defended her right to be there, the part that had just agreed to marry a man she'd known less than a month, that part wanted to do this loudly and publicly and without shame. "Then let's do it right now," she said. "Today. Let's go find Reverend Matthews and get married before anyone can try to stop us." Wyatt's face split into a grin, the first real smile she'd seen from him since the day they met. "You're sure?" "I'm terrified," Nora admitted, "but I'm sure." Mrs. Chen appeared in the doorway at that moment, her face carefully neutral, but her eyes sharp. "The babies sleep now. You should go before they wake and need feeding again. I packed Mrs. Dale's things. You take them when you return." "Thank you," Nora said. "For everything. For taking me in, for not judging." "Everyone deserves a place to land when they fall," Mrs. Chen interrupted. "You landed. Now you fly again. Go." Reverend Matthews lived in a small house behind the church, and his wife answered the door with flour on her hands and surprise on her face when she saw who was calling. But when Wyatt explained what they wanted, simply, directly, without apology, she disappeared inside and returned with her husband, who looked between them with the expression of a man who'd seen too much of human nature to be shocked by anything anymore. "You're sure about this?" he asked, his question aimed at both of them, but his eyes lingering on Nora. "Marriage is a sacred covenant, not a solution to gossip." "I'm sure," Nora said firmly. "I know how this looks. I know people will say we're rushing, that we're making decisions out of desperation instead of wisdom. But Reverend, sometimes wisdom looks like choosing life over propriety. Sometimes it looks like building a family from broken pieces instead of waiting for perfect circumstances that will never come." Reverend Matthews studied her face for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "All right, let me get my book. Martha," he called to his wife, "we'll need you and Thomas as witnesses." The ceremony was brief and simple, conducted in the preacher's parlor with his wife and adult son standing witness. Nora wore the same worn dress she'd had on all morning, and Wyatt's shirt was still stained with baby spit-up. The babies slept through the whole thing, wrapped in their blankets and blissfully unaware that their lives were being irrevocably changed. When Reverend Matthews asked if Wyatt would take Nora as his lawfully wedded wife, to have and to hold from this day forward, for better or worse, in sickness and health, until death parted them, Wyatt's voice was steady and sure. "I will." And when the same question came to Nora, she looked at this man she'd known less than a month, this grieving widower with 2 babies and a failing ranch and more problems than solutions, and felt something settle in her chest that felt almost like peace. "I will," she said. The ring Wyatt produced was Mary's wedding band, and for a moment Nora hesitated, but Wyatt seemed to understand her pause because he said quietly, "She'd want them to have a mother. She'd want me to choose life over grief. And this ring, it's just metal. What matters is the promise we're making to each other right now." So Nora let him slide the gold band onto her finger, feeling the weight of it settle into place like an answer to a question she'd been afraid to ask. "I now pronounce you man and wife," Reverend Matthews said. "May God bless this union and grant you strength for the journey ahead." They walked out of that house as Mr. and Mrs. Wyatt Kane, and Nora felt like a different person than the one who'd walked in. Not better or worse necessarily, but transformed. No longer Nora Dale, the disgraced widow who'd lost everything. Now Nora Kane, a woman who'd been given a second chance at the life she'd thought was gone forever. The ride back to Mrs. Chen's boarding house to collect Nora's belongings was quiet, both of them processing what they'd just done. But when they arrived and Mrs. Chen handed over the packed carpet bag with a knowing smile, Nora felt the reality start to sink in. She was married, again, to a man she barely knew. With 2 babies who needed her and a ranch full of work waiting and a whole town that would have opinions about what they'd done. "Ready?" Wyatt asked, and Nora could hear the same mixture of excitement and terror in his voice that she felt in her own chest. "No," she admitted, "but let's go anyway." The ranch looked different when they pulled up. Or maybe Nora was different, seeing it now as her home instead of her temporary refuge. The house needed paint and repairs, the barn door was hanging crooked, and the whole place had that air of barely controlled chaos that came with grief and exhaustion and too much work for too few hands. But it was hers now, her home, her responsibility, her future. Lily woke as they were climbing down from the wagon, and her cry brought Nora's milk down immediately. Some things at least were still simple and instinctive, even when everything else felt complicated and uncertain. "I should feed them," Nora said, "and then I suppose we need to figure out—" She gestured vaguely at the house, at the situation, at the fact that they were now husband and wife but had never even kissed until an hour ago. "Everything." Wyatt's expression was gentle. "We don't have to figure it all out today. Today we just need to feed the babies, make some dinner, and survive until tomorrow. That's enough." But as Nora carried Lily into the house, her house now, she knew it wouldn't be quite that simple. Because word would spread. Was probably already spreading, actually, from Reverend Matthews to his wife to whoever she told over afternoon tea. By tomorrow, everyone in town would know that Wyatt Kane had married the scandalous widow, that they'd done it quickly and quietly without any of the usual courtship rituals, that the woman who'd been driven from his home in disgrace was now returning as his wife. The reactions would be swift and brutal. She could already imagine the whispers, the pointed looks, the women who'd crossed the street to avoid speaking to her. But she'd survived that before, and she'd survive it again. Because this time she wasn't alone. This time she had a husband who'd chosen her knowing full well what scandal it would cause. This time she had 2 babies who depended on her, and a home that needed her, and a purpose that went beyond simple survival. She settled into the rocking chair, her rocking chair now, she realized with a jolt, and got both babies situated for feeding. Wyatt moved around the kitchen, starting dinner with the comfortable efficiency of a man who'd been managing alone for too long. And in the golden afternoon light filtering through windows that needed washing, Nora felt something she'd almost forgotten existed. Hope. Fragile and uncertain, but real. The hope that maybe this crazy, impulsive decision would turn out to be the best thing either of them had ever done. That night, after the babies were fed and sleeping, after dinner was eaten and dishes washed, came the moment Nora had been quietly dreading. Bedtime. She stood in the kitchen while Wyatt checked the doors and windows, her carpet bag still sitting by the stairs where he'd set it that afternoon, and tried to figure out what was expected of her now. They were married. That meant sharing a room, sharing a bed. That meant, well, it meant things Nora wasn't ready to think about, let alone do. She'd been a wife before. She knew what happened on wedding nights, but this was different, wasn't it? This wasn't a normal marriage. They'd gotten married for the babies, for propriety, for practical reasons that had nothing to do with desire or passion, except that Kiss in Mrs. Chen's boarding house had felt pretty passionate. Wyatt must have seen the panic building on her face because he stopped his circuit of the house and came to stand in front of her. "Hey," he said softly. "What's going on in that head of yours?" I'm wondering about the sleeping arrangements," Nora admitted, her face heating. "I don't want to assume anything, but we're married now, so I suppose—" "You'll take the spare room," Wyatt interrupted gently, "the one you had before. I'll stay in mine. Nothing needs to change tonight, Nora. We have all the time in the world to figure out what this marriage looks like. There's no rush." The relief that flooded through her was so intense it made her dizzy. "You're sure? I mean, you have rights as a husband." "Rights?" Wyatt's eyebrows rose. "Nora, I'm not going to force myself on you just because we signed some papers today. When and if we decide to share a bed, it'll be because we both want to, not because some legal document says I'm entitled to your body." Tears pricked at Nora's eyes again. God, she'd cried more today than she had in weeks, but these were different. Relief, gratitude, and something else. The growing realization that she'd married a genuinely good man, not just a desperate one. "Thank you," she whispered. "Don't thank me for basic decency," he said, but his voice was kind. "Now go to bed. The babies will be up in a few hours wanting to eat, and you need rest." Nora climbed the stairs to the room that was hers again, set her carpet bag down on the bed, and stood for a moment looking around. Nothing had changed since she'd left. The same narrow bed, the same washstand, the same window looking out over the dark prairie. But everything felt different. Before, this had been a temporary stopping point, a place to rest until she was inevitably pushed out. Now it was home. She changed into her nightgown and crawled under the covers, her body exhausted but her mind still racing. She was married to Wyatt Kane. She was a mother to his children, legally and publicly. She had a home and a purpose and a future that looked nothing like what she'd imagined a month ago. And when Lily's cry woke her at midnight, and she went downstairs to find Wyatt already there, fumbling with lighting the lamp when they worked together to change and feed both babies without needing to speak much beyond, "Hand me that cloth, and I'll take him next," Nora realized something that made her chest tight with emotion. This was what partnership looked like. This stumbling through the dark, figuring it out as they went, choosing each other every day kind of partnership. It wasn't perfect or romantic or anything like the fairy tales promised. It was exhausting and messy and complicated. But it was real, and it was hers. And for the first time since her baby died, Nora felt like maybe, just maybe, she was exactly where she was supposed to be. The town's reaction came swiftly the next morning when Pete arrived for work and found Nora in the kitchen making breakfast. His eyes went wide, and he stammered something about needing to talk to Mr. Kane before practically running to the barn. He returned half an hour later with Wyatt, looking shaken. "Is it true, ma'am?" Pete asked, his hat crushed in his hands. Did you and Mr. Kane—" "We got married yesterday," Nora said calmly, pouring coffee. "Reverend Matthews performed the ceremony. It's all legal and proper." Pete's face went through several expressions before settling on something like relief. "Well, congratulations, ma'am. Sir, it's just that Deacon Hill was asking me questions this morning about whether Mrs. Dale was back at the ranch, and I didn't know what to tell him, and—" "Tell him Mrs. Dale is dead," Wyatt said flatly. "Mrs. Kane lives here now, my wife. If he has a problem with that, he can take it up with me directly." By afternoon, the visitors started arriving. First came Martha Simmons, her face tight with disapproval, barely masked as concern. Then Ada Cooper and her husband George. Then, most troublingly, Deacon Hill himself, his expression grave and his Bible clutched like a weapon. Nora watched them approach from the kitchen window, her stomach clenching with anxiety. But Wyatt's hand settled on her shoulder, warm and steady. "Together," he said quietly. "We face them together." So they stood side by side on the porch as Deacon Hill climbed down from his wagon, and Nora felt Wyatt's hand find hers, their fingers lacing together in a display of unity that was as much for them as it was for their visitors. "Mr. Kane," Deacon Hill said. "Mrs." He paused, clearly struggling with what to call her. "Mrs. Kane, I've heard some disturbing news." "If you've heard we got married, that's not news, it's fact," Wyatt said evenly. "Reverend Matthews performed the ceremony yesterday afternoon. We're husband and wife, legal and proper in the eyes of God and the law." "Married," Deacon Hill's voice was flat. "Less than a month after your wife died. To the very woman whose presence here caused such scandal that I had to arrange for her removal." "Mary died 6 weeks ago," Wyatt corrected. "And you didn't arrange for Nora's removal. You threatened to take my children unless I complied with your demands. There's a difference." "Mr. Kane, surely even you can see how this appears," Martha Simmons interjected. "Marrying so quickly to a woman who is already living here, people will say she seduced you while you were grieving, that she trapped you into marriage." "Let them say it," Wyatt interrupted. "I know the truth. Nora saved my children's lives. She kept my household running when I couldn't manage alone. She gave me a reason to get up every morning when all I wanted to do was give up. If that's seduction, then I'm grateful for it." "But the impropriety," Deacon Hill started. "There was no impropriety," Nora said firmly, finding her voice. "Everything between Mr. Kane and myself has been entirely proper. We married in haste because the babies need constant care, and the town made it clear I couldn't provide that care unless I was his wife. So we became what we needed to be to save these children. If you have a problem with that, take it to God, not us." The silence that followed was thick with tension. Then Ada Cooper surprisingly spoke up. "I think it's romantic," she said quietly. "Two people finding love in the midst of tragedy, choosing to build a life together despite impossible circumstances. If they're married properly, blessed by the church, what business is it of ours to judge?" Her husband George nodded slowly. "Ada's right. Marriage is marriage. They've done it legal and proper. Rest is between them and God." Deacon Hill looked like he'd swallowed something sour, but he couldn't argue with that logic. Finally, he gave a stiff nod. "Very well. Since you're married, I suppose there's nothing more to be said, but Mr. Kane, Mrs. Kane." He looked at them both seriously. "People will be watching. They'll be looking for any sign that this marriage isn't what you claim it to be. I suggest you conduct yourselves accordingly." "We'll conduct ourselves like any other married couple," Wyatt said, "working our ranch, raising our children, living our lives. If people want to watch, let them. They'll see exactly what we are, two people doing their best to build something good from broken pieces." After they left, Nora sagged against Wyatt, suddenly exhausted. "That was only the first wave," she said. "There'll be more." "Probably," he agreed, "but we'll face them too, one day at a time." And they did. Over the following days, more visitors came, some genuinely wishing them well, others clearly fishing for gossip or signs of scandal. Nora faced them all with her chin high and Wyatt at her side, and slowly, the tide began to turn. Because the proof, ultimately, was in the living. The babies thrived, gaining weight and color and strength. The house became cleaner, more organized, more like a home than a disaster zone. Wyatt started to smile again, started to look less like a man barely holding himself together and more like someone who'd found solid ground. And Nora bloomed. That was the only word for it. She moved through the house with purpose and confidence, her hands always busy, her voice often heard singing to the babies or humming while she worked. The hollow grief that had haunted her eyes began to fade, replaced by something that looked almost like contentment. They were building something real. Something that maybe had started as desperation and convenience, but was growing into something more. Something that felt, day by day, more like the marriage Nora had always hoped for, but never thought she'd have. 3 weeks into the marriage, Nora woke to find Wyatt's side of the hallway dark and silent. He'd been sleeping later recently, finally catching up on weeks of exhaustion now that the babies were settled into a routine, and Nora was there to handle the night feedings. But when she came downstairs with Lily fussing for her morning meal, she found him sitting at the kitchen table in the pre-dawn darkness, his head in his hands. "Wyatt." She shifted Lily to one arm and touched his shoulder. "What's wrong?" He looked up and his face was haggard. "The bank sent a letter yesterday. I've been putting off opening it, but I finally did last night. They're calling in the loan on the ranch. I have 60 days to pay what I owe, or they're foreclosing." The bottom dropped out of Nora's stomach. "How much?" $300. He laughed bitterly. "Might as well be 3,000. I don't have it. The herd's too small after losing so many to wolves and weather. The crops didn't come in well enough. I've been barely making the interest payments, and now they want the whole amount." Nora sank into the chair across from him, Lily squirming against her chest. "What happens if you can't pay?" "We lose everything, the house, the land, the barn, everything Mary and I built, everything her family left us, gone. And I'll have nothing to offer you and the babies except more poverty and shame." "Stop that," Nora said sharply. "You're not offering me poverty and shame. You're offering me a home and a family and a life that matters. Money doesn't change that." "Money changes whether we have a roof over our heads," Wyatt said roughly. "I can't, Nora. I married you promising I'd take care of you, and now I'm about to lose the only thing I have to give." Lily's fussing intensified, and Nora automatically began unbuttoning her dress to nurse her. As the baby latched on and the familiar routine took over, Nora's mind raced through possibilities. $300. It was an enormous sum, more than most people saw in a year, but maybe, what if we sold some cattle, she suggested, or took on extra work? I could do washing and mending for people in town, bring in a little money. "It wouldn't be enough," Wyatt interrupted. "Not in 60 days. We'd need a miracle." They sat in grim silence while Lily nursed, the weight of potential loss pressing down on both of them. Everything they'd fought for, the marriage, the family, the fragile sense of home they'd built, all of it threatened by something as mundane as money and bank loans and bad luck. When Pete arrived for work an hour later, he found them both hollow-eyed and quiet. "Everything all right, boss, son?" he asked uncertainly. Wyatt told him about the bank letter, and Pete's face fell. "Ah, hell. I was afraid of this. The Johnsons lost their place last month to the same thing, and the Williamson Ranch went under back in January. Bank's been squeezing everyone since that panic back east." "Is there any work around?" Wyatt asked. "Anything that pays decent wages? I could hire out for a few weeks, try to scrape together something." "Not this time of year," Pete said regretfully. "Most ranches are cutting back, not hiring, and even if you found something, it wouldn't pay enough fast enough." He paused, then added quietly, "I'm sorry, boss. I wish there was something I could do." After Pete left for the day's work, Nora finished the morning routine, feeding both babies, making breakfast, starting laundry, while her mind churned. There had to be a solution. There had to be some way to save the ranch, to keep the home she'd only just found. But by midday, she was no closer to an answer, and the hopelessness was beginning to set in. She was hanging laundry when a wagon appeared on the road, and her heart sank when she recognized the driver. Helen, with Victor beside her and their 4 children, crowded in the back. Nora wiped her hands on her apron and went to meet them, steeling herself for whatever judgment or interference they'd brought. But when Helen climbed down, Nora saw something she'd never expected: a black eye, half hidden under powder, and a wrist wrapped in a crude bandage. "Helen?" Nora stepped forward, alarm replacing her defensive posture. "What happened?" "Victor and I had a disagreement," Helen said carefully, not meeting Nora's eyes. "About money and other things. It got out of hand." "Out of hand?" Nora's voice rose. "He hit you?" Victor climbed down from the wagon, his face red. "Now hold on. Don't." Nora's tone could have cut glass. "Don't you dare try to justify it. Get back in that wagon and leave. Now." "This is between me and my wife," Victor said, puffing himself up. "You got no right." "She's my sister," Nora interrupted, "which gives me every right. Get off my property before I have Pete fetch the marshal." Victor's face went from red to purple, but something in Nora's expression must have convinced him she meant it. He climbed back into the wagon, but before leaving he leaned out and spat. "You want her? Fine. Take her and those brats. See how long your precious new husband wants you when you're feeding 6 mouths instead of 2. Won't be so high and mighty then." He drove off in a cloud of dust, leaving Helen standing there with 4 frightened children clustered around her skirts and tears streaming down her face. "I'm sorry," Helen whispered. "I had nowhere else to go. I know you're just getting settled in your own marriage, and the last thing you need is—" "Hush," Nora said, pulling her sister into a careful embrace, mindful of what looked like bruised ribs beneath Helen's dress. "You're welcome here, all of you. Come inside." She got Helen and the children settled in the parlor with bread and milk, then went to find Wyatt in the barn where he was working on repairing a broken harness. When she told him what had happened, his jaw tightened. "Victor's always been a bastard," he said quietly. "I'm glad she finally left. Of course she can stay, the kids too." "But the money," Nora started. "We're already struggling, and now 5 more mouths to feed." "We'll manage," Wyatt said firmly. "She's your sister. They're family. That's what matters." Nora felt something warm bloom in her chest. Gratitude and love tangled together so tightly she couldn't separate them. "Thank you," she whispered. That night, with Helen and her children bedded down in the spare room and the twins sleeping peacefully in their cradle, Nora and Wyatt sat on the porch in the darkness. The weight of everything, the bank loan, the new arrivals, the uncertain future, pressed down on them both. "I don't know how to fix this," Wyatt admitted quietly. "I don't know how to save the ranch and take care of all these people who need me. I feel like I'm drowning and dragging everyone down with me." Nora reached for his hand, lacing their fingers together. "Then we drown together," she said. "Or we swim together. Either way, we're in this as a team." He looked at her, and even in the darkness she could see the emotion in his face. "I don't deserve you." "Yes, you do," Nora said firmly. "We both deserve a second chance. We both deserve to build something good from the ashes of everything we lost. Whether that happens here on this ranch or somewhere else, that's just details. What matters is that we're together." Wyatt pulled her close, and for a long moment they just sat there, holding each other while the night settled around them. And in that moment of quiet desperation, something shifted. Not hope, exactly, but determination. Whatever came next, they'd face it together. The solution, when it came, arrived from an unexpected direction 3 days later. Nora was in the kitchen making bread with Helen's help, her sister proving surprisingly capable once she wasn't trying to manage everything under Victor's critical eye, when they heard horses approaching. Multiple horses, moving fast. Nora's stomach clenched with worry until she looked out the window and saw Reverend Matthews climbing down, followed by Ada Cooper, Martha Simmons, and 6 other women from town. "What now?" Helen murmured. "I don't know," Nora said, wiping flour from her hands, "but I guess we're about to find out." She opened the door before they could knock and found herself facing what looked like a delegation. But instead of judgment or condemnation, she saw determination on their faces. And most surprisingly, Martha Simmons was carrying a canvas bag that clinked with the sound of coins. "Mrs. Kane," Martha said formally, "may we come in? We have a proposal for you and your husband." Bewildered, Nora stepped back to let them enter. Wyatt came in from the barn, clearly confused by the crowd, and they all gathered in the parlor while Helen kept the children occupied in the kitchen. "We've heard about your financial difficulties," Reverend Matthews began. "The bank's foreclosure notice, and we've come to offer assistance." "I don't want charity," Wyatt said immediately, his pride stung. Good, Ada Cooper said briskly. Because this isn't charity. It's an investment. She nodded to Martha, who opened the canvas bag and began stacking coins on the table. The women of the church have taken up a collection, Martha explained. Not as a gift, but as a loan. We're offering you $200, interest-free, to be paid back over 5 years in whatever increments you can manage. Nora stared at the money, her mind struggling to process what she was seeing. $200. It wasn't the full amount they needed, but it was close, closer than anything they'd hoped for. Why? Wyatt asked hoarsely. Why would you do this? Half of you wanted Nora run out of town a month ago. Because we were wrong, Martha said simply. We let fear of scandal blind us to what mattered, 2 babies who needed help, and a woman brave enough to provide it regardless of cost to herself. You two have built something real here, a home, a family, a life that serves as an example to all of us about what it means to choose love over propriety. We'd like to help you keep it. But there's a condition, Reverend Matthews added. Several conditions, actually. Nora's guard went up immediately. What conditions? First, you must allow the church to help with the children's religious education as they grow, the Reverend said. Second, you must agree to open your home once a month for a community gathering. Nothing fancy, just a place where people can come together. And third, he smiled. Third, you must promise to share your story with any young person who comes to you struggling with grief or scandal or feeling like they've lost everything. To show them that second chances are real. Tears were streaming down Nora's face now, and when she looked at Wyatt, she saw his eyes were wet too. We can do that, she whispered. All of it. Thank you. Thank you so much. There's more, Ada Cooper said. George and I would like to purchase 10 head of cattle from you at premium price, enough to give you the additional $100 you need. We've been wanting to expand our herd anyway, and this way you can pay off the bank and restock later when you're more stable. And I've spoken with several other ranchers, Reverend Matthews added. They're willing to offer work to Pete and yourself, Wyatt, during slow times here. Paying work that will help you rebuild your savings while keeping the ranch running. The room swam in Nora's vision, and she had to sit down before her legs gave out. They'd come to save them. The same town that had judged and whispered and threatened, they'd come together to save them. It wasn't forgiveness exactly, but it was something better. It was community deciding that redemption mattered more than punishment. I don't know what to say, Wyatt managed. Say you'll accept, Martha said, and then say you'll let us help in other ways too. Mrs. Kane, Nora, you took on Helen and her children without hesitation. That's admirable, but it's also a lot for one household. The church has a fund for families in crisis. We can provide clothing for the children, food supplies, whatever's needed to help you weather this. Why are you doing this? Nora asked, her voice breaking. After everything that was said about me. Because we were scared, Martha interrupted gently. Scared of what it meant that you were brave enough to do what none of us would. Scared that your willingness to defy propriety made our own choices look cowardly. But watching you and Wyatt these past weeks, watching you build a marriage and a family against impossible odds, we realized we wanted to be the kind of community that supports love, not tears it down. After they left, leaving behind the money and the promises and a future that suddenly looked possible again, Nora and Wyatt stood in their parlor surrounded by evidence of other people's faith in them. Nora thought about the woman she'd been a few months ago, broken, grieving, convinced she had nothing left to offer the world. And then she looked at her husband, at her sleeping babies, at her sister safe in the kitchen with children who were laughing for the first time in who knew how long. We're going to make it, she said wonderingly. We're actually going to make it. Wyatt pulled her into his arms, and for the first time since they'd married, the embrace felt like something more than comfort or gratitude. It felt like the beginning of something neither of them had dared to hope for, real love, built slowly through shared struggle and chosen partnership. I love you, he said quietly. I don't know when it happened or how, but somewhere between that first night you walked through my door and now, I fell completely in love with you, not because you saved my children, not because you were convenient or necessary, but because you're you, strong and stubborn and kind and beautiful and exactly what I needed without knowing I needed it. Nora's breath caught. I love you too, she whispered. I think I have for weeks, but was too scared to admit it. Too scared it wasn't real, that it was just trauma bonding or desperation or... He kissed her, deep and thorough and full of promise, and when they broke apart, both of them were breathless. That felt pretty real to me, he said, and the warmth in his voice made her smile, despite the tears still streaming down her face. That night, after the babies were fed and Helen was settled with her children and the house was finally quiet, Wyatt knocked softly on Nora's door. "Can I come in?" he asked. Nora's heart hammered as she opened the door. She was in her nightgown, her hair loose around her shoulders, suddenly hyper-aware of how long it had been since she'd been intimate with anyone. But when Wyatt stepped inside and looked at her, what she saw in his eyes wasn't just desire. It was reverence, tenderness, the kind of patient wanting that said he'd wait as long as she needed. "I don't want to sleep alone anymore," he said quietly. "Not because I expect anything, but because I want to fall asleep next to my wife and wake up with her in the morning. Is that all right?" "Yes," Nora breathed. "Yes, that's all right." They lay down together in her narrow bed, and for a long time they just held each other, learning the shape and feel and rhythm of being together. And when Wyatt's hands began to wander and Nora's body responded with an eagerness that surprised her, when they finally came together as husband and wife in truth, and not just legality, it felt like a promise being kept. A second chance being claimed. A future being built from broken pieces into something whole. Afterward, Nora lay with her head on Wyatt's chest, listening to his heartbeat slow, and felt something she'd thought she'd lost forever. Complete bone-deep contentment. "Thank you," she whispered. "For what?" "For choosing me. For seeing past all the reasons why you shouldn't, and choosing me anyway." Wyatt's arms tightened around her. "Best choice I ever made." The months that followed were hard work, but good work. They paid off the bank with the combined loan and cattle sale, giving them breathing room to rebuild. Wyatt took the offered jobs from neighboring ranchers, bringing in steady income while Pete managed the Kane Ranch. Nora threw herself into making the house a home, not just for their immediate family, but for the community gatherings they'd promised to host. Helen proved invaluable, her years of managing Victor's household translating into genuine skill once she was free of his criticism. She and Nora worked side by side, cooking and cleaning and caring for 6 children who were thriving in the safety and warmth of a house full of love instead of tension. The twins grew like weeds, Lily bold and adventurous, Jonah quieter but observant. They learned to sit up, then crawl, then pull themselves to standing while holding furniture. And through it all, they remained utterly devoted to Nora, reaching for her when they were hurt, calling for her when they woke, nestling against her when they were tired. She was their mother in every way that mattered, and no one who saw them together could doubt it. The monthly gatherings became something special, neighbors coming together to share food and stories, young couples seeking advice about marriage, women facing hardship, finding support from others who'd survived similar struggles. The Kane Ranch, which had been a place of death and grief and scandal, transformed into a hub of community and hope. And through it all, Nora and Wyatt's marriage deepened into something neither of them had expected. They learned each other's rhythms and quirks and tender spots. They fought sometimes, sharp, honest disagreements about money or children or how to handle difficult neighbors, but they always came back together, choosing partnership over pride. Spring came, bringing new calves and the first green shoots in the garden Nora planted. Summer followed with long, hot days of hard work and cool evenings on the porch while children played and babies slept. And when fall arrived and Nora realized her monthly bleeding hadn't come, when the familiar nausea and exhaustion told her what she already knew in her heart, she felt fear and joy tangled together so tightly she couldn't separate them. She told Wyatt on a Tuesday evening, after the children were in bed and they were alone in the kitchen. He'd been going over the ranch accounts, and she'd been finishing the mending, and the words just spilled out before she could stop them. "I'm pregnant." Wyatt's pencil froze mid-calculation. He looked up slowly, his face unreadable. "You're sure?" "As sure as I can be without a doctor's confirmation, but I know the signs. I've been here before." The silence stretched between them, weighted with everything neither of them was saying. Nora's last pregnancy had ended in tragedy. The memory of that tiny two-still baby was a scar they both carried. The thought of going through that again. "Hey," Wyatt said softly, coming around the table to kneel in front of her chair. I can see what you're thinking. Stop it. How can I not think about it? Nora's voice broke. What if it happens again? What if I lose another baby? What if you don't? He interrupted gently. What if this time everything goes right? What if we get to welcome a healthy baby into this family we've built? What if this is the happy ending we've been working toward? Nora pressed both hands to her still flat stomach, tears streaming down her face. I'm scared. I know, I'm scared too. But we're not facing this alone. We have each other. We have Helen. We have the community. And whatever happens, Nora, we'll face it together. The pregnancy was difficult in ways Nora's first hadn't been. Morning sickness that lasted all day, exhaustion that made even simple tasks feel overwhelming, anxiety that kept her awake at night, imagining all the ways things could go wrong. But through it all, Wyatt was there, holding her hair when she was sick, taking over extra work around the house, rubbing her swollen feet at the end of long days. And the twins, now over a year old and toddling everywhere, seemed to understand in their own way that something important was happening. They'd climb into Nora's lap carefully, patting her growing belly with chubby hands, and babble things that sounded almost like words. Helen was a rock, managing the household when Nora couldn't, keeping the children occupied and fed and happy. And slowly, watching her sister bloom in the safety of a home where she was valued instead of criticized, Nora understood that rescuing Helen had been as much about saving herself. They'd both needed to remember what it felt like to be treated with dignity and kindness. Winter came again, bringing Nora's pregnancy into its final months. The doctor had examined her and pronounced everything healthy, but Nora couldn't shake the fear. Every twinge, every pain, every moment the baby was quiet sent her into spirals of panic that only Wyatt's calm reassurance could ease. This baby is strong, he'd tell her, his hand on her belly feeling the kicks and rolls. Just like their mother. They're going to be fine. On a cold February morning, with snow falling softly outside and the house warm from the fire Wyatt had built up, Nora's labor began. It was nothing like her first labor. The pain was sharp and intense, but there was no sense of something going wrong, no bleeding that wouldn't stop, no fever that made her delirious, just hard, honest work of bringing a baby into the world. Helen stayed with her while Wyatt paced in the parlor with the twins, and the midwife from town, a different woman than the one who'd attended Nora's first birth, coached her through each contraction with firm competence. You're doing well, the midwife said. Baby's in the right position, heartbeat is strong. Just keep breathing through it. But when the contractions intensified and the pain became overwhelming, when Nora's body felt like it was being torn apart, fear crashed over her in waves. Something's wrong, she gasped. It felt like this before. Nothing's wrong, the midwife said firmly. This is normal, Mrs. Kane. Hard labor, but normal. Your baby is coming, and they're coming healthy. I can see the head. One more push, and you'll meet your child. One more push felt impossible, but Nora bore down with everything she had, Wyatt's voice filtering through the door telling her she could do this, Helen's hand tight in hers, and then a baby's cry. Strong and furious and absolutely, perfectly alive. It's a girl, the midwife announced, laying the squirming, screaming infant on Nora's chest. And she's got a good set of lungs on her. Nora stared down at her daughter, red-faced and wrinkled and covered in vernix, and absolutely the most beautiful thing she'd ever seen. The baby's eyes squinted open, unfocused but searching, and when Nora touched her tiny hand, those fingers wrapped around hers with surprising strength. Hello, Rose, Nora whispered, the name they'd chosen weeks ago suddenly feeling exactly right. Hello, sweet girl. We've been waiting for you. The door burst open and Wyatt rushed in, his face wet with tears, the twins toddling after him with Helen trying to catch them. He sank down beside the bed, one hand reverently touching Rose's dark hair, and looked at Nora with such pure love and wonder that her heart felt too big for her chest. She's perfect, he breathed. You're perfect. God, Nora, you did it. We did it, she corrected, pulling him close for a kiss while Rose squirmed between them and the twins demanded to see their new sister. We all did it together. That evening, as the sun set and painted the snow-covered prairie in shades of gold and rose, the Kane household settled into its new normal. The twins were asleep in their beds, exhausted from the excitement of the day. Helen was in the kitchen preparing a celebratory dinner, and in the bedroom, Nora sat propped against pillows with Rose nursing at her breast while Wyatt sat beside them, one hand on Nora's shoulder and the other gently touching their daughter's tiny foot. "A year ago, I was drowning," he said quietly. "Mary had just died. The babies were dying. I didn't know how I was going to survive the next day, let alone build any kind of future. And then you knocked on my door in the middle of the night, and everything changed." "A year ago, I wanted to die," Nora admitted. "I'd lost my baby and my husband and any sense of purpose. I thought grief was all I had left. I never imagined this." She gestured at the room, at Rose, at the life they'd built. "I never let myself hope for this much happiness." "Are you happy?" Wyatt asked, and despite everything, there was vulnerability in the question. Nora looked at her husband, this man who'd chosen her when he could have chosen safety, who'd fought for her when it would have been easier to let her go, who'd built a life with her from absolutely nothing. She looked at the baby in her arms, alive and healthy, and hers. She thought about Lily and Jonah sleeping down the hall, about Helen safe in the kitchen, about the community they'd found in the most unexpected places. "Yes," she said simply, "I'm happy, more than I ever thought possible." Rose finished nursing and fell asleep with that boneless contentment only babies achieve, her tiny rosebud mouth still making sucking motions in her sleep. Nora held her close, breathing in that distinctive new baby smell, and felt the last piece of her heart that had been broken finally click back into place. She'd lost a baby once, lost a husband, lost her innocence, lost her belief that the world was fair or kind or just. But she'd found something better than fairness. She'd found grace, found second chances, found a love built not on perfection, but on persistence, not on easy circumstances, but on choosing each other every single day despite impossible odds. Outside, the first stars appeared in the darkening sky. Inside, Helen called that dinner was ready. Wyatt carefully took Rose from Nora's arms so she could get up and join the family. And as they walked down the stairs together, husband and wife, partners in every sense, Nora felt the weight she'd been carrying since her first baby died finally lift. Her body had known, somehow, that she was meant to be a mother, had refused to give up on that purpose even when her mind said it was over. And now here she was, in a house full of children who called her mama, with a husband who loved her not despite her brokenness, but including it, with a future that stretched out bright and full of possibility. The ache in her chest, the one that had haunted her for so long, was finally gone, replaced by exactly what her stubborn, faithful body had known all along. She was meant to love and be loved this much. She was meant to build a family from broken pieces. She was meant to prove that second chances were real, and that sometimes the best things in life came from the courage to keep walking forward, even when the road ahead looked impossible. As they gathered around the table, Helen serving the food, the twins in their high chairs babbling happily, Rose sleeping peacefully in the cradle Wyatt had built, and Wyatt's hand finding Nora's under the table, Nora offered up a silent prayer of gratitude. For grief that taught her strength, for loss that taught her what truly mattered, for darkness that made her appreciate light, and for a love that proved that even the most broken hearts could be stitched back together into something whole. The woman whose body wouldn't stop believing she was a mother now had a house full of children, a husband who chose her in front of the whole world, and a life sown from grief into something beautiful. And as they said grace together, voices mingling in thanksgiving, Nora knew with absolute certainty that this imperfect, complicated, hard-won happiness was exactly what she'd been fighting for all along. This was home. This was family. This was love in its truest, most resilient form, and it was finally, completely hers.